I want to open today with an audio clip from a former presidential candidate in America named John Kerry. And as he says what I'm about to play, about 2 minutes, he's at a World Economic Forum panel. Trust me, give this a listen for 2 minutes. And then, of course, I've got a few comments on the backside and some extra episodes, extra interviews that you will love. But I thought it was terribly important to start today with this.
And I think the dislike of and anguish over social media is just growing and growing and growing. And it's part of our problem, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. It's really hard to govern today. You can't, there's no, the referees we used to have to determine what's a fact and what isn't a fact have kind of, been eviscerated to a certain degree. And people go and people self-select where they go for their news or for their information. And then you just get into a vicious cycle. So it's really, really hard, much harder to build consensus today than at any time in the 45, 50 years I've been involved in this. And there's a lot of discussion now about how you curb those entities in order to guarantee that you're going to have, some accountability on facts, et cetera. But look, if people go to only one source and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change. Now, obviously, there are some people in our country who are prepared to implement change in other ways. And
so
that's
you're
really
questioning
dangerous.
really if democracy can survive unregulated social media.
I think democracies are very challenged right now and have not proven they can move fast enough or big enough to deal with the challenges that we are facing. And to me, that is part of what this race, this election is all about. Will we break the fever in the United States?
So let me get this straight. This guy says some people and their views are sick, or they have an agenda, or they have disinformation. And the American First Amendment blocks him from what he wants to do. And ladies and gentlemen, what does he want to do? He wants to be your God. And you are nothing more than a pissant, a peon, a sucker. Now, at the very end there, he says something about the election. Are you kidding me? So the election is about whether America has free speech or no free speech? Really? I know plenty of very smart people on the quote left who never expressed that to me, never had those thoughts. He's saying quite clearly what he believes the election is all about. The election is about whether he and his side can be gods and can tell you whatever forever. That's what it's about. I just wanted to play that because we're all thinking people, right? We're thinking people who want to learn, have great lives, and move forward. But when you have elite lizard people like this, it's tough to be normal. Meaning it's tough for us to just have a normal life and say, well, we're just going to work our job. We're going to do our trading. We're going to read our books. We're going to raise our family. And we're not going to pay attention to this stuff. Because if a lizard son of a bitch like this gets control, all the things that we want to do, and we are nothing more than slaves to a demon like this. And any man who can say what he just said is a demon. Now, let me calm down here because I've got three very pleasant, very educational, very insightful episodes that I want to play, interviews that I want to provide today. But like I said, I had to lead with this. Without any further delay from me, jump right into a long form learning, fire hose to the mouth. See you again next week. A good trend-following conversation today with somebody that I'm meeting for the first time, at least meeting on Zoom for the first time. My guest today is Richard Brennan. He is down under. He's in Australia. He's a trend-following trader. He's got a really interesting story, interesting background. We kind of cover the gamut, going all around his life and back and forth and bouncing the ball across the net with me. So please join me for this conversation with Richard Brennan, who, by the way, was recommended by Jerry Parker. And you know what? If Jerry says, hey, Mike, you should probably have this guy in your show. He's interesting. I trust Jerry. Without any further delay, let's jump right into a little bit of trend following with Richard Brennan. I hope you enjoy. I don't know if I'll put this on the podcast. Depends on what you say. I've not been to Australia. I've flown over it on my way to New Zealand. And again, I'm not saying this in a mean way, but has there ever been a country that more people thought of more highly than Australia, that has done its level-headed best to look terrible on the world stage in the last 1 year? I just can't imagine. I mean, it's Men at Work. It's Crocodile Dundee. No one has something bad to say about Australia. And in 1 year, travel plans, I'm not going there. What happened?
We've never followed the normative route. We've always been a bit out there, and a lot of people have always thought the Australian mentality, they're rebels, but that's not the reality. We do basically follow the rules in Australia. It's quite clear based on our response to COVID. But one of the things that does set us apart a bit from the rest of the world is that we cut losses short. What we were able to do, fortunately, at the commencement of the outbreak was we put a cap on it really hard, really fast. We didn't allow that tail event to emerge. We suppressed it immediately, created this safe realm in Australia where we watched the world enter this COVID pandemic and the associated issues and the build-up of this tail event in the world. And we were thinking to ourselves, gosh, how fortunate we are over here. But ultimately, it got to a point where we had to accept that we needed to emerge from this virus. We needed to accept entry in of this virus, but there was a lot of popularity across the states in Australia. The individual state politicians turned into little local overlords. Our federal system took a back seat while the states were basically controlling who could get into and out of the state. There was so much popularity expressed by those states that took a very aggressive stance to COVID, prevented people from coming in on the basis that they were protecting the public. A lot of people liked that, but that didn't allow us to enjoy certain freedoms a lot of the world didn't have over the course of the pandemic, because in Queensland, where I am, we might have only entered lockdowns a few times, but the majority of the time it was business as usual. But the people that were affected, of course, were those that were reliant on immigration or those that were reliant on tourism from interstate or international sources. So, of course, that side of the economy was hampered.
This policy that you're describing is not unlike Vietnam, not unlike other countries where the first year they kind of sealed the borders and said, hey, we're safe, and there was not a spread. And then the second year with Delta, it started spreading and the lockdowns didn't work. And then all of a sudden, when the lockdowns don't work and everyone has their, quote, come to Jesus moment, we're all going to get this thing. It's going to be endemic. We can't stop it. So all you can do is protect yourself, maybe get the vax, whatever one's got to do to protect themselves. But there is no way to seal the border on COVID. And I think what's happened now, and it seems like you're describing that, and again, I'm seeing it in other places too, is that these governments, they have that first year of success. They're like, oh, look at all the press clippings. And then the second year, none of those policies work at all. And now they just look like petty tyrants.
Exactly. There was this initial strong support for them, but as it wore on, you started to get this growing discontent. We needed to lock down, very slow to move. So they didn't recognise that this whole process was adaptive, and they assumed that their early stage controls were the way to go into the future. But I think they're paying the price now, Mike.
You slide in with the word adaptive, which I think is fair because that's where we're going to go a lot today, in the sense that adapting situations. You can't keep planning. These governments keep planning and people keep planning their finances, and they're going to figure it all out, and they're going to predict tomorrow, and tomorrow comes and it ain't like yesterday, and yesterday doesn't matter if it's gone, as Mick Jagger sang in Ruby Tuesday. So, I mean, here we are, right?
They're applying all of these predictive premises that you and I hate, these Gaussian premises. So at the moment, everything's contingent around this figure of 80% vaccination. The assumption is that the unvaccinated, unclean, unkept people evenly distributed throughout the population. But that's not actually the case. It might be 80% from a Gaussian statistic, but we get lots of pockets of this unvaccinated locales, which the problem's going to persist.
But the unvaccinated could have already had COVID and recovered and have a natural immunity that far exceeds the damn vax. Everyone wants to talk about the vaccinated, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but in the sense that, what about the folks that have got natural immunity? It's like, it's not even part of the equation. You're a data guy, so you're going to sit here like me and you're going to look at all these things. And I'm sure you just pull your hair out when you say, oh my gosh, we're tying one arm behind our back to look at these issues, and you can't do that.
Yeah, it's full of assumptions. And I'd like to see what these models are doing, because it's quite clear that they're faulty. I believe they're based on these narrow assumptions, these homogenous variables which are spread throughout. It's a real minefield, Mike.
First, you brought up adaptive. Now you brought up models and the sense of looking at COVID, which is a great way to think about this. I'm sure most people don't think that there are government officials with government doctors and a bunch of contractors being paid a lot of money to code up, because they've got the, quote, academic pedigree, to code up what they think they've been taught in school that will apply to this real world situation. And when it doesn't work, which is probably what's going on behind the scenes, what are they doing? They're just kind of doubling down, and they're refusing to say that our models are faulty.
You and I know we can't predict tomorrow, let alone next week. So all of these modelers are based on a faulty premise. We know that this whole COVID outbreak and the way it adapts and evolves, you've got to adopt a Basian sense of reasoning where, as more data comes to light, you've got to adapt and change your strategies. But the assumption that these strategies are enduring and hard and fast and last for all time is nonsense to people that view things perhaps like you and I do.
Why do they not have any Basian thinking at all? I didn't grow up with the term even, but why do you think they don't have any Basian thinking at all? Why is it the Gaussian thinking? Why are they so flat-footed? And I'm not just speaking about Australia. It could be governments around the world.
I think it's a human condition, Mike. It's how we use our brain. I was reading a magnificent book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, 7 short lessons on the brain. She really knows her stuff. She's a neuroscientist who's been involved in understanding how the brain works, and her conclusions quite profoundly were that the brain's primary role is not to think, it's not to rationalize. The brain's primary role is to predict. So in the context of how we've evolved in this natural environment, that's been a very good strength for us. But all systems are not the same. So the system we might have evolved in is not necessarily the system that we find ourselves with COVID, or the system we find ourselves in trading these markets. And to put a predictive brain into those contexts, you're going to therefore necessarily have these faulty assumptions. You're going to be applying a recipe that might have been appropriate for a different system into a new system, and you're going to get this error. You're going to get this uncertainty. I think that's probably the problem faced everywhere. But everyone loves prediction because that's the way our brains think. But the reality is the system has the last laugh, and they don't necessarily like the term prediction.
I agree with everything you said. But as I get older, I start to think, well, you're being diplomatic in the sense that the people that want to go down the prediction path, are they just in error, or are they choosing a faulty path on purpose because the faulty path looks good to the unwashed masses, sounds good to the unwashed masses, and it allows people that choose a faulty prediction path to maintain power, to have control, and to make money?
Exactly, Mike. No one's going to appoint a politician on the basis of his uncertainty. The regulators are going to stand there in very certain terms saying exactly what they do. We will show you the way. We will show you the path. It's based on knowledge that you don't have, but we have. We're looking after you. And so that whole premise is sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, Mike.
Why do you have this perspective that allows you to analyze the world this way? Because we've not chatted before, and I'm curious, where does it start? Were you 13? Were you 15? Were you 17, 21? What's the kernel for why you have the thinking that you're describing to me? We're not even into trading or COVID right now. I'm taking you back in time. I want to know, what is the moment, the trigger, the something that happened to cause you to be a skeptic?
It's a bit of an Alan Watts story here, Mike. It was a process of exponential learning that occurred in an instant of time. So up until the point I was about 25, I'd led life according to the code of what my parents had taught me, the facts that I'd received. It was all there in my head, but it was very fragmented, disjointed. I didn't have an actual opinion on anything.
Did you trust it all, or are you just not sure?
No, I did. I trusted it. And yes, it did me well by the path that I was able to take with that level of trust. But the path obviously was a narrow path, and it certainly didn't have these spectacular outlier events that I now can appreciate. But it was a steady path. It was a path of mediocrity. It was a path of acceptance. And this is where your podcasts come in, Mike, in the way you challenge that with critical thought. So I didn't apply critical thinking.
Just a time frame this year, in your mid-20s when you're starting to kind of wake up, so to speak?
Yes, I'd done a degree at uni in geology, and I'd always liked geology. So I naturally went into geology and came out the other end as what they call a soft rock sedimentologist, which is basically people with a degree of expertise in petroleum and oil exploration. But at that point in time that I came out in Australia, the industry as such was very highly towards the minerals, the mineralogy side, the gold, the nickel, that sort of stuff. So there weren't many opportunities open for people in soft rock sedimentology. So I spent 2 years just twiddling my fingers, hoping that opportunities would arise, went into the hospitality industry, made ice creams and sorbets.
I want to stop you for a second. You're the first person. I could be underexposed, but you're the first person who's ever told me, well, I wanted to go into geology. So you're going to have to tell me why exactly, because this is going to tell me something about you. No one's ever just said to me, you know what, I want to go into geology. Okay, a doctor, attorney, whatever. Geology, now it looks good now. Gold mining, whatnot, etc. Oil. There's a money component there. But what was the motivation for you?
Motivation for me was to try and understand this concept called deep time. I always had a fascination with evolution. I always had a fascination with dinosaurs, a fascination with how carbon deposits form, how minerals form, looking at the course of geological time, which therefore made my mind much more expansive, eliminating the short-term view, looking at everything from the big picture. If I look back, that was probably one of these formative areas to look at things wider, more holistically than narrow and specialized. So this was my first chance at spreading across disciplines as opposed to investing heavily in a single discipline.
Before I interrupted you, you were talking about going into ice cream. You'd have to continue.
Right. I spent the time twiddling my thumbs, working in hospitality, making ice creams and sorbets for restaurants and things like that, working under a very good chef, excellent chef from France. And he basically taught me how to view cooking, to put some joy into the process, the joy of food, the joy of producing something good, the joy of quality. And that laid very good surrounds. But at that time, I was hanging around with a lot of drifters. And at that time, based on the fact that I hadn't achieved anything, there was this thing in the back of my head saying, you've got to achieve, you've got to achieve. But that was not being realized while I was working in restaurants, working in hospitality, etc.
Let me push you a little, because I think people are going to be thinking, well, where does the trend following fit in? I'm thinking of somebody who's become a good friend of mine, Larry Height, extremely eclectic background early on, but then he woke up and he made a pivot. First moment, trend following, when was it? Why did it happen?
I would say the moment came after a failure of predictive techniques for about 20 years.
So you were trying predictive models for 20 years on all kinds of things, and they weren't working. I had a guy on, Bill Dreiss, and Bill goes back in time, and he's looking at some of these early influences that he saw. Did you discover trend following entirely on your own? Was there some light bulb that you saw? Was there a mentor? Was there a book? What was the moment that woke you up?
It's so interesting you say Bill Dryce, because yes, he was definitely one of my mentors. So Bill Dryce, Jerry, of course, but Jerry came sort of later. I really got attached to Bill Dryce back in about 2013. He was pumping out these fantastic returns and I was clearly struggling.
So you were not aware of trend following at that moment?
Mike, I lived 20 years of my life spent basically in the shadow, not knowing that there was this trend following success story. And your books brought that to my attention.
Okay, I didn't know what you were going to say, but I'm still trying to press in the sense that I want to know the exact moment. You said my books. My books would have been, first one was 2004. So that was before Bill. I don't know when you saw it. But I still want to press you that when you had that first moment, and maybe it was Bill, maybe you're telling me that already, that first moment of this is trend following, I know what it is. For me, it was seeing in the 1990s what Jerry was doing with the turtles. So that was my first moment.
My real moment was seeing a validated track record, understanding a validated track record.
Another party's track record, somebody else's?
Yeah, so recognizing that there were firms. I'd been spending 20 years of my life since late 80s, dabbling in lots of different techniques, actually working in the industry in areas of compliance. And under that realm of compliance, I had exposure to some of the investment programs that wanted to slot under our compliance framework. So in that context, I got to see what some of the investment fund managers were doing. But all of them were mostly value investors at that stage. But there were a couple that I saw in about 2012, these validated track records of 20, 30 years. Now, that picked my ears up.
Who would these have been, for example?
Dunn was one of the big boys that really attracted me.
If somebody has a pulse and they've never seen the Dunn track record, and then they see the Dunn track record, if their pulse doesn't quicken, they might be dead.
That's exactly right. This is what always grabbed me. We're not talking 5 years. We're not talking 10 years. We're
45?
Well, yes, and long may they ever live. I can't see it ending. So this is a track record of robustness and stellar return.
So for you, your process, and this is actually similar to mine, I was looking at the performance track records in the early to mid 90s. And so I'm looking through the old Stark report and I'm looking at these things and I'm seeing the correlation. Why are they all making money in March? Why are they all losing money in April? They're all making money in May and June. Then they're all losing money in July. What's going on here? Something's connected. They're not living in the same city. They don't know each other. What the hell's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. What's more stark to me is that when I read that Greg Zuckerman's book, he compiled this list of top traders. And of course, there was Jim Simons sitting at the top. There was Two Sigma. There were these other funds. Still, there was this lack of representation of trend followers. So I thought to myself, hold on. I know that a lot of these trend followers had better performance returns than Buffett. Why does Buffett appear in there, but we don't see these track records? So then went to the literature, looked at their track record, and lo and behold, I don't find just 1, 2, or 3 that we can classify as Jim Simons, Warren Buffett, or whatever. I find 30, 40 trend-following funds with a track record on a risk-adjusted basis that outperforms Buffett. And I'm thinking, is the industry ignoring them? What's happening? Why aren't they represented in the track record story? And that then opened this whole Pandora's box into how I see that this particular segment of the industry is being suppressed, notably by economic theory, which challenges this notion that trend followers actually exist on, this notion that markets are efficient. Well, that's not what a trend follower exists on. Trend followers exist on this market that is non-linear, has these moments of serial correlation or these spectacular exponential growth in trends. And this is the stuff that the dogma associated with economic tradition has suppressed. Of course, they don't want people to know that because it goes against the grain of what their whole premise of their theory, that markets are efficient and investors are rational. So lo and behold, that's how the story came.
Let me add 2 cents to the efficient market hypothesis, or whatever one wants to call it, theory. The longer I go on, I don't think they believe any of it. I really don't. I think it's all a power thing. And so the efficient market hypothesis has got plausible deniability. So people in power, in academia, in brokerage firms and banks and whatnot, they kind of hide under this thing because they can just say to their clients, the average guy who's got the money with them, we've got these Fama papers and he won a Nobel Prize and just be quiet. I don't think they'd even believe it. They just realize that if they allow kind of an open discourse to let the average consumer of financial products, to let that average consumer have the same aha moment that you had about the Dunn track record, they know they can't do that. So it's a power thing. I don't think they believe any of this shit.
No, exactly. They want us to believe in mediocrity. That's what they want us to believe in. So this whole sort of thrust is towards this notion that, hey, active fund managers out there, they rarely outperform the overall market. Markets are efficient. All investors can participate in what the market delivers, but they're failing to understand that who wants to go for mediocrity when you can go for superb.
That was your moment, though, is the track records. The track records were your light bulb moment. You were like, okay, this data is telling me something. You're already a little bit of a data guy. So this data is waking you up and going, oh, what's going on here?
It wasn't saying that these guys are successful. It was saying that 30 to 40 of them were successful, even more successful than maybe the handful that appear in the top fund managers in the world. So why is there this dominance of this particular style of investment program at the expense of all others? That tells me that there is superior models and inferior models. Trend following, therefore, stood out to me as a superior model. And then I had to understand why.
We're right back to the beginning where I'm bringing up the idea of COVID models. This all kind of ties together. The average person jumping in, maybe they don't see the connection, but it's all about a model. So let's get into the specifics, because you love to use the phrase complex adaptive system. I don't typically use it. I kind of know where you're coming from, but I guess I just kind of look at the world and assume all of what's behind it. But I'm going to let you get academic and explain it. But essentially, it's the world has got a lot of variables. There's a lot of stuff going on, and our ability to analyze it all to then make decisions using all of these inputs is just a tortuous, self-indulgent dream fantasy that we all have. How can we make decisions in light of all this conflicting information? What can we look at to make a decision? What can we grab onto to make a decision? And price data is pretty effective at that, isn't it?
It is, Mike. I think it's about this premise that the standard model, the Gaussian model, where everything is normally distributed, that's a very naive, simplistic model of how I view any system to behave. So when I examine systems, and I'm not just talking trend following here or finance, I'm talking any natural system. Any natural system that you investigate, when you dig down into the nuts and bolts of it, the things in that system disappear, and those things are replaced by process. When you start examining things scientifically and start narrowing your microscope to really investigate the nuts and bolts of how it all fits together, you come to this point where things just vaporize into a probability cloud. The things that we took for granted, such as the static things, they're not things at all. There are processes. The way I view systems is this interrelationship and interactions existing, systems within systems within systems within systems. And they're all moving. And no system is independent of another system. So that tells me that over time, systems change, they unfold, they adapt. There is no notion of static. And when I examine this notion of the word random, the more I get into it, I see that, well, randomness actually doesn't exist. It only exists when you're looking at a single system and you're looking at those variables in that system that don't have a correlated impact on that system itself, but they are important for external systems within which those systems are embedded. So they're not actually random, they are related to a different system. So the way I see this world unfolding, this dynamic interplay of cogs within cogs, is the way I see how all of it knits together into what I call a covariant universe. In other words, a non-random universe, a universe that makes sense. There's cause and effect in it. There is a path. Everything actually does have a place, but the way we analyze it when we reduce to this method of reductionism that we undertake with most of our scientific observations, we tend to put things into a closed laboratory under very specific circumstances where we can stand outside like gods looking into that system.
We try to control it.
We try to control it. Exactly. But what we've got to realize is we are participants in the system. We're not gods from outside looking in. Now, as soon as you are a participant in a system, you interact in that system and you have a role to play. There is an interrelationship between the behavior you have, between the behavior Mike has, the behavior Jerry has, the behavior all of these people have. all of this interplay creates these relationships or interdependencies. And when you get these correlated dependencies building, you get trends emerging. It's this positive feedback that exists in these system contexts of processes. And positive feedbacks is something that the world has ignored up until about the 1980s. And then in 1980s, we got an institute in the US called the Santa Fe Institute that started saying, hey, science, what you've done to date has been very important because you've reduced everything to the building blocks. However, what you're missing out on is the importance of the interrelationships between systems. Here is another way of presenting how markets behave. The likes of Brian Arthur come out with this notion that, hey, the economic models that traditionally were always based on an assumption of equilibrium. Things would oscillate around an equilibrium. And the story of equilibrium is a story of what I call path dependency. In other words, when you do a back test, a predictive modeler uses that history of that back test as a basis to predict how the future is going to unfold. It's based on one single path of history. It's a path dependency. However, the reality is that systems offer this path dependency to have a braided multiple path possible outcome dependent on what opportunities exist at one point in time versus what opportunities exist at another point in time. And what that means is you have a very winding path across many different possible histories to produce where we are in the now. And if you continue that forward into the future, you realize there is not one single path into the future. There is this braided view of this many possible paths of probability. Each one is determined by our decision and our choices at any particular path.
Let me add something in there, though, too, just for context so people can put an example to it. We brought up the Dunn track record. You're talking about many opportunities and, obviously things are constantly changing. Well, that means is that all the money that Dunn might make in year one might come from XYZ group of markets. In year two, it might come from an entirely different group of markets. And that's such a critical thing to understand for the average mind. And I'm not saying we're above average, but the average mind wants this consistency dream that doesn't exist.
I look at the story of the turtles. What would have happened if Jerry Parker hadn't responded to that ad in the Wall Street Journal? There wouldn't be a Jerry Parker today that we would probably be aware of. There was a very path-dependent process where these outliers existed in his history, fundamental points of change, which were transitional change. So this notion that there is no steady change, things happen in punctuated moments of massive change. Pivotal moments, Jerry responding to that ad, me stopping making ice creams. You can go through your history and see these pivotal moments. Now, these are all decision points. Path dependency really matters. And when I look at the track record of the trend followers and I see their path that their equity curves take, you see the impact of outliers in their history. Now, this is what really picked my interest up because these outliers are a manifestation of non-random, serially correlated events that really are life-altering. They're transitional events.
Put some context in there. For example, this could be the fall of 2008. A big event happens and all kinds of markets that don't look like they're connected start to do something unexpected. And if you have the wrong kind of model, you're not going to benefit. If you have the right kind of model, you're going to benefit.
Exactly. So the model is the key here. The constraints applied by the model is the key because the market itself holds the opportunity. The model is the way to extract that edge from that market. Now, buy and hold is not a model. It's just a let's invest now, close our eyes, and 30 years down the track, based on our assumption that economies always grow, I can leave that model with a profit. Along the way, you're going to have these major asymmetrical, nonlinear adverse moves, and you're going to have these major nonlinear beneficial positive moves. But the two will effectively neuter each other out, cancel each other out. So what that means is that they therefore get the benefit of the slow, boring change. They don't get the benefit of this leveraged, amplified, beneficial change that nonlinearity in our equity curves produce, because our systems demand that. We cut losses short, we let profits run, so we never stray too far towards the left tail of the distribution of returns. We're stunting them to produce a linear loss result, -1, -1, +1, -1, -1, +1, but we catch this occasional significant outlier, +20. And when you get that +20 added to that linear series, suddenly you get this massive amplification of returns. So in 2008, when we found that the markets actually were all correlated, all started going the same direction together, trend followers with their systems happened to be in that right direction, we doubled our returns 100% in 2008. This wasn't the small change that we're used to today of 1% up, 1% down. This was a doubling associated with a non-linear market feature. But our systems were the things that extracted that edge from that market. And when I look at what is the real game changer in delivering returns in the long term, I used to read a lot of investment books, and one of the big ones was this principle of compounding. So we all know that when we compare a compounded series against an uncompounded series, you can see that compounding acts as a two-edged sword. It can either massively amplify returns if you've got this positive beneficial asymmetry in that uncorrelated underlying return stream, or it can exacerbate and produce this massive decline in wealth if you're asymmetrically inclined the wrong way. When I look at what trend following models do, which is superior to what other models do, I see this asymmetry in this model, which allows compounding to really magnify the results.
You've got a great way of really analyzing this at a very high level. Let's break it apart, though, so people can really wrap their arms around this. What's so cool about trend following, the models, is it's kind of like saying, we don't know what the hot opportunity will be this year. We don't know what the hot woman will be this year. We don't know anything what's going to be hot. But when hot appears, we want to get on with the hot. We want to be with the hot. And we don't know what's going to happen, but if we know the foundation that you've just described, this systems foundation, when the hot appears, built behind it is the idea that trends persist. And that's a really tough one for people, because they're looking at a market that's flatlining forever. And then all of a sudden there's this couple 100-day breakout. And people are like, well, why is that important? Well, it might only be important 40% of the time, but it's still, when you start to crunch it through the trend following model, it is important. Because again, how the hell can you figure out what's going to be the next hot thing unless you're taking chances to get on board? And when you take those chances, they're not all going to work out.
One of the big things is you hear people talk about, well, why was Warren Buffett so successful, or why was Soros so successful? They put it down to these key handful of major events.
For Buffett, Coke, Gillette, I mean, those are major events, right?
Exactly. I remember your podcast on Valiant Pharmaceuticals. If you were short during that period of that decline of Valiant Pharmaceuticals, you might be a very wealthy man now. So there are these moments in time where things go linear. They're non-random, but they go linear. And we've got to accept this because we see it in all systems. We see it in a fossil record. We see the evolution of life not being sort of gradually changing over the course of time. We get these periods of change interdispersed by these fantastic episodal events, what I call punctuated equilibrium. We get these massive change events which suddenly totally reshuffle that system and create a new niche for exploitation. So you need these periods of transition to disrupt the system to create greenfield opportunities that didn't exist before. And then you suddenly get an explosion of a new species, and then you get another change event, totally changing the direction. And ultimately, here we stand as human beings. But it's not that human beings are special. We're just the outcome of this path dependency of life and evolution over eons. And the same occurs with trend following. Trend following is based on the notion that systems change. If there was no change, there would be no trend. It's an inevitable consequence. We adopt this non-predictive philosophy, understanding that the nature of these systems is that way, that there will be these major change events. But we drop any form of prediction because a predictive method assumes an exact knowledge of how that future state's going to unfold. And we say, well, no, the major opportunities exist by you simply being present at a point in time with a system that's ready to turn on at that point in time. People are lucky. And when they say, what does it mean to be lucky? Well, it means you've got to be in the right place at the right time. So we say, yes, that is exactly right. But we apply a process to do that. To be in the right place at the right time means we must be diversified to be in the right place. And to be in the right time, we must have a systematic process that's turned on 24/7, might not be active, but is sitting there waiting to jump on any of these nonlinear opportunities. And then, therefore, you've got to be a participant in this process. So you've got to survive. So the key requirement is we must be like the robust cockroach that simply survives, but is present for these opportunities, and with their diversified systems and with their particular asymmetric system that's systematic, turned on all the time. It simply happens. We will be the beneficiaries. We will be the cockroaches.
I communicate with a lot of people. I know a lot of people, a lot of different voices. As I get older, I'm realizing that even for some people that I might be an ally with, friendly with, I have nothing bad to say about them personally. But at some stage of the game in the financial space, when you see people who base their careers off, I know what the Fed will do next. I believe this is the type of Fed policy that is great. I think rates will go up. I don't want to go get into a fight with folks over these issues. That's what they want to do, and that's what they want to spend their life doing. But there's a side of me that does want to fight. There's a side of me that does want to just say, oh, come on, shut the hell up. That's complete nonsense. You know it. I think so many people have figured out a way, and somebody could say this arguably about me or you, so many people have figured out a way to participate in the financial world. And the ways that they might figure it out might make them a lot of money. But the foundation on so many of these philosophies and things that people say is just 100% nonsense. They don't have any insight at all. They literally write books dreaming up these philosophies. They understand the arcane. They can piece it all together. They're just brilliant. And they might be brilliant if you're measuring them in terms of IQ, but their philosophy is just horseshit. And it doesn't make any sense. We're in the middle of this odd circumstance now where we're all connected and everyone's got something to say. But most people, when it comes to finance, money, etc., what they have to say is not useful at all.
Totally agree, Mike. It tends to be from the mindset of youth, where you believe you have the power, you're in control. And I think as we age and as we become more experienced and understand things in a much wider context, we realize the hopeless futility of that whole premise, that argument. And when I see your podcast, where I get a wealth of information from, I see you drawing from the minds of the best in the world across vast different disciplines. What that does to Mike Covel is rewiring his neurons to remove this thought of control or your ability to control, but it's increasing your ability to appreciate, and it's increasing your ability to recognize that we are just agents in this majestic system called life. There are ways to live a better life. It's not a fair world. It's an asymmetric world. There are better decisions than others. These are things that we reach at the tail end of our lives when we realize the stuff that you hear in the mainstream, that's noise to me. I avoid that conversation. It's not adding anything to me as a person, to me in connecting those light bulbs up, making it all make sense.
I'm sure you feel this way too. I'm lucky in the sense that I bumped into a particular style of thinking, philosophy about the markets, about investing, about trading, and that I didn't realize at the time how much this would correspond with the way that I was probably going to think about life already. Meaning I might not have ever heard of trend following, but I would have already gone in this kind of direction, maybe the way you were describing yourself. And I'm sure a guy like Jerry Parker, he had the same kind of realization earlier than you and I, where he kind of like, wow, I already had this way of being, this way of thinking. And then somebody shows me this way to deal with the markets and money and trading. It all dovetails together. And for all of us, it's not like we're sitting around saying, oh, we're the smartest guys. We're just lucky in the sense that we don't have to pretend that we're making something up. We're just kind of looking at, here's what it is, here's what to do, and that's it. You're not trying to make some fancy salad. It is what it is.
There's a good scene at the end of Saving Private Ryan where he's at the cemetery overlooking his friends who didn't make it during the war, and he's thanking them for giving them the legacy that he now stands upon. And I think that's how I accept life now. I recognize that what you hear from me as Richard now is really me as Jerry, me as Tom Basso, me as all of the people that have been influential on changing the way I think. I recognize that all of that has actually not been through my own efforts. It's been through understanding vast different perspectives. And the more you pluralize these perspectives, the more you come to understand a much more Eastern way of considering life. The whole thing about Western democracy, the whole thing about the Western religion, you clearly see it's about control. It's about the autocratic religions, we're controlling you. But when you get into understanding more about the Eastern religions, it's not about control at all. It's about empowerment. It's about this strive for illumination, to understand the connections that exist, which empowers you. And I think that whilst I'm not a spiritual type of person, I think ultimately as my life ages and I'm drawing on more and more of these experiences and different perspectives, I think I have a much grander appreciation of how it all connects than someone who's gone down that control path because they're privy to only a specialized, narrow scope. They've missed out on this wonderful thing called life that exists outside of that. And I think this philosophy of trend following is a culmination of that because it's far wider than just a trading technique. It's a way to live your life, to go with the flow, to acceptance. It's not about control. It's about taking the opportunities that are presented to you, that stand out to you. But you won't see those opportunities if you adopt this controlling mindset.
That could be like my obituary for how I ended up in Vietnam. I mean, I think you just described it to a T.
Could be. I think Spike Milligan had one of the best obituaries on his gravestone. He said, see, I told you I was sick. We're going to have some corny statement, a bit of an Ed Secoto riddle on our gravestones to say, hey, we were trend followers.
You brought up Ed Secoto. You brought up Tom and Jerry, and I'm thinking of Richard Dennis and his influence on Jerry. Here I am in a Buddhist country at the moment. And you brought up Alan Watts earlier. If one looks at these Wall Street precepts that people really love, Ed Secoto's comes to mind. Everyone gets what they want out of the markets. If you lose all the time, you were getting what you wanted, something like that. I lay this out and you bring up this Zen connection. Most of these great Wall Street precepts that we love, it's all Zen. None of it is control-based. The stuff that we love, the stuff that people quote, the stuff that Buffett says, the stuff that Soros says, the stuff that everyone says, all the names that I just mentioned, it's all Zen. And I'm not saying they swiped it or they paraphrased it back to Picasso. Everybody's stealing a little bit everywhere. How do you make it into something fresh? But really, when it comes to these great Wall Street precepts about money, investing, finance, etc., it's all Zen. The Buddhist guys had it figured out.
Definitely. It's amazing the paths we weave. I took a journey from science that ultimately took me into trend following. I had a very strong interest in the likes of Richard Feynman, David Bohm, an amazing physicist who started looking at thought as a system. All of these different physicists, Einstein, they were all Zen. They understood this broader picture. And then they undertook their hypothesis to basically explain a component of their Zen. And lo and behold, it works out. This totally changes this domain from one of certainty to one of uncertainty. Up to the 1900s, everything was predictive modeling. Everything was based on Newton's principles of, we know in a clockwork universe how everything's going to unfold. Einstein challenged that because Einstein listened to Mach as a philosopher. So the philosophers were infiltrating the way he thought, and that challenged this whole notion of what Newton had, and he totally revolutionized the landscape of mechanics. Really, the change was small, but it had huge consequences. The whole nature of the realm that mechanics operated in was so different to what Newton had predicted, this fixed domain where things happen predictively. Now we have this dynamic domain where space moves and undulates and energy gets redistributed and reconcentrated. This is how our life goes, Mike. We have these transformative moments. It might be a small change, but it has magnificent effects on how we view our prior thought processes. We get this domain shift, a transformation that suddenly explodes the way we think with new opportunities. New light bulbs start flickering.
I still remember asking, I think it was on a second or third edition, I remember asking Bill Dunn if I could use his bucking bronco quote on the front cover, just a quote that was in the book, but I was like, that so sums it up. We're not making predictions, we're just riding the bucking bronco. It's such a lovely way because it's so visceral. Everyone gets it. You're riding the bucking bronco. Okay, I can imagine that. I can see the bucking bronco. I can see you on it. I can see you holding on. And sucker's bucking, trying to kick you off. Hold on, you're not trying to control the bull. You're just riding it. You can't control the bull. I'm trying to control the bull my whole life. That doesn't work so well. I don't make market predictions. I just ride the bucking bronco. Literally, those handful of words from Bill Dunn are more valuable than 99% of the 300-page investment books that you could find on Amazon. Those handful of words, I don't make market predictions, I just ride the bucking bronco. Just take that, put it on the wall, and throw everything else out.
It's the same as the old David Ricardo statement. The mantra I live by, cut losses short, let profits run. Incredibly powerful.
Hard to do, though.
Absolutely. But it's a bit like being delivered an alien technology that just works. You don't have to understand how it works, just apply it. When I see these statements of life that people come up with, you realize that it's incredibly nuanced what they say. It might be a simplistic statement, or it might be an Ed Secoda statement that has you sort of thinking it's a Zen riddle. But deep within that is a highly nuanced expression that connects so many goddamn things. It should not be taken lightly. People might find it hard to understand Jerry because he certainly doesn't think like the classic sort of quant in a tie and suit when he explains things. I love the way Jerry speaks because I tend to interrogate everything he says, understanding what the nuances are in what Jerry says, because when I unpack that, I get this wealth of knowledge suddenly being transferred to me by something flippant that Jerry might have said in a short statement. It's a bit like he throws out this complex mathematical formula in this very concise way that is ridden with, laced with information, and it's up to you to unpack it. And really, it's got to be you because that's the only way you're going to accept it and understand it.
What I think with Jerry, which is really interesting, is to think about his career from where he started. So he starts on this, quote, level playing field with the, quote, other turtles. Let's say there was approximately 20. The experiment ends. They all go off and do their own thing. Jerry ends up doing the best, but quite a few others did really well. Paul Raybar, Tom Shanks, Liz Cheval, several did well. But what's really interesting is the divergence that Jerry took, meaning you don't have to understand alien technology to use it, but you got to have some semblance of it because there's clearly something that a guy like Jerry brought to the table that other folks did not bring to the table. Now, in all fairness, for example, Liz Cheval passed on suddenly. She might have continued to have a fantastic career. She had a great career. But Jerry has survived and he has prospered. And it does seem like, and I thought this early on, because I spent a lot of time analyzing these individuals and I talked to a lot of these individuals. And let me tell you, as smart as Jerry is, as practical as Jerry is, as down to earth as Jerry is, a couple of the folks that he was in class with, and I don't know if he would say this, but I would say this because I've got their recorded interviews, they were sort of nuts. So Jerry was not anywhere close to nuts, but some of these folks were out there. And that gets back to the genius of Richard Dennis in the sense that he kind of did this experiment and he proved a lot of things with that experiment. I wrote a book about it, but I think Jerry's got something that not all of the other turtles necessarily had. And maybe some people don't want to hear that. Maybe some people want to say, oh no, we were all equal. I'm not buying it.
Yeah, I think Jerry embraced it. There was something in Jerry that made him automatically fall in love with it. He often says when he was presented with the ideas of Richard, it was just something that he thought was the best thing in the world. And to have that immediate appreciation of something tells me that he's already pre-aligned to accepting it. And the system that is Jerry is configured in the correct way to bring on board this and apply it. Actually, interestingly, I found out that Jerry had a bit of an acting career as well. Did you know about that?
I did not know about the acting career. Okay.
All right. So have a look at Me, Myself, Irene with Jim Carrey.
Oh, I remember that. Okay. I thought you were talking about something before the Turtles or something. Okay.
There's many facets to Jerry. You might think it's all about trend following, but there are many shades to Jerry, which I love.
Let me bring up something as we wind down, just kind of something I wrote down that I wanted to bring up. And I think it dovetails well with your start in analyzing and going down the trend following path, which is looking at performance data. I sometimes joke with some of the practitioners in this world that a lot of these other names for trend following were invented because if they started using trend following, they would all end up going to the guy who owns trendfollowing.com, which is me. So we came up with time series analysis and all these other things, some of the things before trend following, CTA and managed futures and all these things that people want to use. And momentum. So that's probably the newest way to not use the phrase trend following. So they didn't talk about momentum trading. It gets described as, okay, finally the academics have come on board and said, oh yes, we now believe in momentum trading. We can now see that it works. They still haven't even looked at the track record of Bill Dunn, but they now know momentum trading works. They came up with two types of momentum. Of course, they renamed these suckers something new too. Time series momentum and cross-sectional momentum. And the cross-sectional would be the relative strength and trend following would be time series analysis. Now, these are two entirely different damn things. They are not the same thing at all. Academia will tell you, oh no, we figured out momentum, we know it now, and there's two forms. The skeptical person would say, okay, fair enough, academia. Now I'm back over here on the time series side and I can see, well, there's a Jerry Parker, there's an Ed Seykota, there's a Bill Dunn, there's a John Henry, there's a whole list, there's Mann, there's Winton, there's all these people over here. On the time series side, okay, that looks like a validation. We've got something there. That looks like it's interesting. We should investigate further. And then I look over on the other side of momentum that academia invented, and I say, where is it? Where are all the track records? To this day, where are the freaking cross-sectional relative strength track records? The same as the ones I just described. Do they exist? I've not seen them yet.
And that's what I've found as well. I scour the performance track records and I produce these monthly track records of fund managers, particularly focusing on the CTAs, because they have the demonstrated long-term track records. There's the survivors with a strong performance record. I'm not finding any examples of cross-sectional momentum in the 30, 40-year track record. Now, this is not to say...
There could be somebody out there doing it, yes. We're not saying that.
There could be, but we're not finding 30 to 40 to 50 of them. We're finding a few rare examples, a bit like the Buffett story and a bit like the Jim Simon story. We're not seeing a whole collection. When I look at cross-sectional momentum methods, I think to myself, oh, what a shame they're doing that, because what they're doing in their premise is they're adopting, once more, a predictive mindset with the assumption that something that has expressed recent outperformance in the past is going to continue on into the future. And I think to myself, why? The whole trend following mantra is to follow price, not to predict it. Now you're telling me that we've got a method that people often do confuse with trend following, because I know some of these cross-sectional methods to sneak into our trend following lexicon. They're not the same. They're different beasts. I think really this huge edge that we've got over them is that they're almost going down this convergent predictive premise to try and squeeze out opportunities in these more regulated regimes of 2010 on, where quantitative easing has been suppressing the markets. And yes, they might have been successful over the last 10 years, but...
It's mostly theory, though.
Yeah, it's theory. And there'll be a few academic papers. I know that Gary Antonacci has demonstrated the academic papers that do support it, but it's an inferior edge. That's the thing, Mike.
It's presented as an equal thing. That's what bothers me.
Yeah, there are no trade-offs in this world. It's an asymmetrical world. There are some methods that are better than others. A lot of people get annoyed with me because they think I'm a fanatic in relation to trend following when I just say that it's a superior approach. Now, I don't mean to denigrate these other methods, but I just know from the performance track record that it is a superior approach. Show me a 30-year track record in this superb risk-adjusted return performance. I'm more than willing to accept that I'm wrong.
I think many people that listen to my podcast, they'll know where we're going as we're talking about these track records, but we're talking about basically professional trend following track records and the education you can get by looking at the monthly returns. It's just a tremendous thing for people to go examine. It's out of this world, what you can learn.
I remember clearly in one of your videos where you stepped through Dunn's performance month by month using a monthly performance table. The first thing you do is you present this equity curve and you say, who wants this? And everyone goes, yes, I want this. And then you say, but look what you've got to do to achieve this. And you step through the month by month. You see these protracted periods of underperformance, but then you'll occasionally see this bright, glowing spot of outperformance. And this asymmetry in that series, these bright spots more than pay. It's the Ed Secoda whipsaw song. These trends pay for them all and then some. So when you get these outliers, these nonlinear beneficial features, forget your drawdowns. A drawdown is a necessary expression to get the returns we get. Volatility does not equal risk. It's path dependent. These opportunities of transitions are spectacular moments that none of us can predict. You've just got to be there. You've got to have your systems triggered and you've got to be trading them and jump on board.
When I just brought that up a second ago and I interrupted you and I brought up the idea of looking at the performance again, there was a thought that I had the brain fart on that I forgot that I really wanted to push on, which is the idea that when one looks at these performance track records, now, this doesn't necessarily help the investor that's going to invest with these individuals. It could give inspiration to people that want to do it on their own. But when you look at that Dunn performance or any of the professional trend following performances, they're capitalists. So they hold their services out and they get a fee. So when you're looking at those performance track records of trend following, for example, the Dunn 45 years, when you're looking at that, that is after their fees. So we're talking about amazing performance that's after fees. So if one just wants to look at this purely on the philosophy, the theoretical part of how much money, independent of the managed money industry, independent of traders getting the pay that they say they want for their services, independent of all that, if one just looks at adding back in the fees to the performance track records that you've brought up, talking about going back decades, it's a hell of a lot more money than people are really thinking about.
Net asset value after fees and expenses. That's right.
I've always thought that's an amazing side part of all of this. Richard, very cool. I'm happy to chat with you. I hope you didn't think I was crazy. You were laying some of that early backstory, but I knew I wanted to let that mind get into trend following. I wanted you to get there and get into it and roll with it. And I think you did a really good job of that.
Thanks, Mike.
So listen, where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them to? I know you've got a bunch of podcasts you've done out there also with Top Traders Unplugged, and people can find those. I've not listened to any of those, so I don't know. Was I more normal or less normal than Niels?
Just different approaches. Loved your method.
Do I have an approach? I like to think of myself as just being adaptive. Whatever you're going to give me, I'm trying to go there.
You dig under the covers. You bring out some interesting new thing that might not have been heard before. So you burrow into it. I love your interview technique.
Fun stuff, fun stuff. Hey, where can we send people though? Where would you like to direct them?
The website, atstrading-solutions.com, and Twitter, my handles at richb118. They're probably the two most dominant areas you can catch me.
Cool stuff, man. I thank you for coming on. We'll get everything up and get it live.
Thanks very much, Mike. A real pleasure.
My guest today comes recommended by a prior guest, Henry G. He recommended the good professor, Nikki Clayton. She's a British psychologist. She is a professor of comparative cognition at the University of Cambridge. Let me tell you right now, check her work out if you're a curious individual. Her specialty has been birds, intelligence in birds, intelligence specifically in corvids, or as you might know, crows. And then taking it a step further, how this contrasts with early childhood development of us Homo sapiens before we can speak. I joke with her at the beginning about how do you give people the elevator pitch about your career and what you do quickly? She got a laugh out of that. You'll hear her answer for that to my elevator question, which is quite funny because I did not expect where she was going to go with that. I am so lucky to do this podcast, so lucky to talk to literally world-class scientists And Nicola Clayton is one of those who have had the chance to find insights that have changed the course of history. So cool. I feel like I'm in school forever, but a good kind of school, like that school that kind of wakes you up, keeps you energized. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Nicola Clayton and gain a little bit of insights into the intelligence of crows. Let's imagine you're on an elevator, and this is kind of the origins type question, the origin story. And people start saying, well, what do you do? I don't know. I work at the bar. I'm an attorney. I'm an accountant. I'm a singer, whatever. And they look at you. They say, what do you do, Nikki? And you say...
Well, firstly, if I was in an elevator, I would be like, don't talk to me until the elevator stops. Because I'm terrified of elevators. And in fact, you'd really have to work hard at coaching me to get into said elevator. In fact, I've been known before to walk up 33 flights of stairs rather than get in said elevator.
Is there the possibility that somehow or another, through the magic of what's going through the waves in the air, all the way from London to me in Saigon, that I knew this? I did not know that.
I used to have to do grant evaluations for the European Research Council, and their meeting room was 32 floors up, and I refused to go in the elevator on my own. Either somebody had to walk me up or come in the elevator. Quite often, they'd choose to walk up. I'm reasonably fit because I'm a dancer, so I would kind of shimmy up quickly up these stairs. A young gentleman who was half my age, after the 10th lot of flights, he'd be like, and I'd be like, what's your problem? And despite my stiletto heel, I'd be clappering up because I don't like lifts. And the reason I don't like lifts or elevators is because when I was a postdoc working in Germany, I got trapped in an elevator with 100 little zebra finches, and they were as stressed as I were. They were in cages and they were all flapping around and very, very stressed. And I had a massive asthma attack from all the dander from the feathers. I just don't do that anymore. I've got legs. They seem to work quite well despite my age. I'll just shimmy on up. So there you go.
I do 56 flights of stairs per week, part of my routine.
That's good. That's really good. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so you're not on the elevator. You're sitting out at the barbecue, and somebody says, what do you do?
Could we have me sitting by an ocean, sipping a nice glass of Sauvignon Blanc? Can we do that?
I'm flexible.
Kind of like the sea breeze and the ocean flowing, and I'm sipping a nice glass of wine, and it's sunset.
Okay. And you do for a living, what do you do again?
I'm being naughty, but I like that. Okay, well, I guess I'm a hybrid. I'm a scientist and I'm an artist. The scientist part of me studies how crows and other animals, including human beings, think about the world.
That raises all kinds of possibilities, doesn't it?
The artist in me says that what I'm really interested in is how we think without words. There you see how the two things meet.
Can I give you just a quick background so you know something about me? I'm American, and I decided...
Where are you from?
Near D.C. in Virginia.
Okay.
On a speaking tour, talking about my investment books on a lark, I ended up in Asia in 2013 on a 4-month speaking tour. And I decided not to leave. I was everywhere in Asia. And I said, well, I'm going to stay. So I said, where did I have the most fun in that 4-month period? And it was Saigon in Vietnam. So I stayed. I started thinking about it today and I was like, wow, is this one of the reasons that Henry potentially turned me on to you? Well, I don't speak the language. I've been walking the streets of Saigon for a long time. I don't know what the signs say. I don't know that I care that much. If you were to kind of like psychoanalyze me, you would probably find that a lot of the things that you study for somebody that doesn't speak the language, has to do a lot more observing and a lot more intuition to get by in a culture like this. But I enjoy it. It's fun.
And behavior reading, right?
I was thinking about that today. I was like, oh my gosh, wow. She will completely get the whole, going on to infinite detail about how someone like me manages. You can instantly probably meet things going on in your head already.
Yeah. I'm just watching your behavior movements as you're talking.
I could be a little bit of a ham. But you can too. I saw your TED Talk. You have fun on the stage.
Well, life's for living. Remember somebody saying to me, you have to take your own responsibility for your health. Yes, you do. Fair enough. But also you have to take own responsibility for your life. We only get it once. Enjoy it, make the most of it.
Take me to a pivot point. So you say the hybrid scientist, artist, so much detailed study of crows, babies. What was the trigger? How did this hybrid come to exist?
I think it started probably when I was 2, very, very early on in life anyway. My mum would say when I was 2. I never bothered to crawl. I either shuffled on my bum and then I discovered how to use my legs and started walking. As soon as I started walking, I was fascinated with birds. I'm a birder through and through. Fascinated by the variety, but also the way they move, the way they think, what lies behind that beady eye. That's really what got me through everything. Really, the answer is a fascination with birds, minds with feathers, if you like.
This is something that I think, and again, Henry mentioned this in my interview with him, your work with crows. And I think most people have made some casual observations of crows here and there. Probably not much more than casual. You've gone a step deeper than casual.
When I applied to university, I wanted to do a degree in psychology and zoology, but Oxford didn't do that. They gave me the option. I could either do zoology or I could do psychology with philosophy or politics. I wasn't sure which one to choose. The people that were interviewing me, Vernon Butt and Lord John Krebs, said to me, well, and this was particularly Lord John Krebs actually, well, if you chose zoology, you could do a bird-related research project. Immediately I went, right, I'm doing zoology. And that's what got me. And we've been close friends ever since. And he's been very influential in my life one way and another. That was my thing. So the first research project I did involved marsh tits, which are very cute, very pretty little birds. But when they imprint, when they are babies and they learn to follow a finger or a metal bell, they don't recognise the face of a human being. Whereas I also had the pleasure of an honour and privilege of working with Eurasian jays. They immediately looked at my eyes. The big thing about the corvids, members of the crow family, including the jays and ravens and crows and magpies, they recognise people's faces.
Was that just an obvious, okay, obviously they recognize my face, or was there something to that you had to prove and justify that scientifically?
For me, that was just an observation. Later on, the credit must go to John Marsland for that, because he's the one that scientifically demonstrated that corvids recognise people's faces independent of what they're wearing. And he did all the careful scientific study. That years later, I have to add, just intuitively, my goodness, there's a complete difference here. The jays are really watching me and recognising individuals and behaving quite differently to different individuals. And that fascinated me.
I think for me, the big picture, there's many big picture points in your career and what you get into. And I think a lot of people listening right now are still kind of waiting for the drum hit to really wrap their arms around things. If you could, for the audience, if you could start to contrast, for example, because you're talking about the corvids, ravens, etc. Why don't you contrast that to their intelligence, for example, to a chimp? Most of us modern humans would think, well, okay, chimps, they're not too far along away from us Homo sapiens, and there's just no way that those birds are in the discussion. But that's a wrong way to think, isn't it?
That's a lovely way of putting it. I suppose I would say that people assume, even who aren't from a biology background, assume that if we're to look for intelligence in other minds, we're going to find them in our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. But as a biologist, and my degree ended up being in zoology, you know that evolution works in two different ways. There's either homologous evolution, where you find shared traits in organisms that are very similar, or there's convergent evolution, where you find traits in very different species, distantly related species that have similar problems to solve. And that's the case with the crows. Both socially and physically, they have very similar problems to solve. But of course, it's interesting because morphologically, they're very different. They have wings, they don't have hands. That's something I'll come back to later, if I may, because we've been doing some stuff with magic at the moment. I suppose the idea is of parallel or convergent evolution, that these very different species have, although they come from different points, birds don't have hands, but they do have wings. They fly and live in a three-dimensional world. We live in a two-dimensional world. All those things impact the way we think. As a dancer, I'd call it embodied cognition. But on the other hand, how fascinating that they've been subject to similar selection pressures. Actually, they seem to have come to similar kinds of solutions to the problem.
You just brought up something, though, that made me think, as somebody on the outside looking in, getting a chance to observe you. You said three-dimensional. As we're talking about birds, and of course, we should all know this, we observe, but then you think, well, gosh, what would it be like to think in a three-dimensional way as you're diving towards the earth or flying up on an angle or something? I mean, it's got to be an entirely different wiring system.
Yeah, got me intrigued both as a scientist and a dancer, of course, because in contemporary dance, the whole idea of thinking that you could move as a bird and have this freedom, but it's not just a single jeté into the air, but what if it was like that you just jeté and come back down, but you could jeté and then stay in the air? That gives you very powerful analogies for movement.
There's so many insights we could go into, but you're taking that man or woman off the street, me. You really want them to kind of have an awareness, that light bulb moment of where, for example, corvid or a crow intelligence is. What would be some of the examples, or what would be a good example that you would want to lead with? It's maybe one of your favorites to bring people into some of the fantastic insights that you've been able to figure out.
I think I'd start with tools, because everybody understands how useful tools are, Homo habilis and all the rest of it. But we all understand how we've been able to do things through the invention of tools that we couldn't do through the invention of just using our hands. Hammering a nail, I couldn't possibly do just with my hand. And there are far more complex tools, a sander, whatever you choose to make. The whole idea that crows are unusual in the animal kingdom because they can use and make tools, but many of them don't do so in the wild. It's not just Mother Nature that shaped this ability. In many crows, New Caledonian crows, okay, they do so in the wild, but the fact that rooks and jays have a conceptual understanding of tools, even though they don't naturally designed, they weren't programmed to use them, I think is quite stunning. I suppose the experiment I would start with is the Aesop's fable one of the crow and the pitcher, and show that the jays and the rooks understand that if the vessel in place has water in it, you need to put heavy stones in it, not light objects. So they seem to understand. I'm not saying they understand the Archimedes principle, of course not, but they do understand a basic thing, that heavy objects are much more likely to sink, and therefore the water level will rise. Light objects just float on the top. And that's an experiment that we've shown children don't pass until they're 8 years of age. So I think that's what I would start with. Of course, scientifically, it's called causal reasoning, but I would just say an understanding of what does and doesn't work.
What's interesting about that, too, is that the experience part of it, meaning if they're in the wild, they don't necessarily know how to do this, but then faced with a captive situation, they can then apply this reasoning or develop this experience back to the wild again. They might not have any ability to do it. What that brings up for me as an outsider looking in on your career is there's a whole level of untapped intelligence, probably in many lines of the animal kingdom, that we have no earthly idea about. They've just not had a chance to learn and grow and use their minds as we have. But if given the opportunity, they can.
Yeah, so the example I would give is if the only things you gave me to eat were crisps or chips in America and apples, I don't need a knife and fork, do I? In fact, it'd be a really bad idea to use a knife and fork to eat potato chips, crisps. They just crumble everywhere. Fingers are much better. So I don't need a tool.
I eat bacon with my fingers. So.
There you go. There are some things you need a knife and fork for, and other cultures might use chopsticks for these things. I love Asia as well. When we go to China, one of the fun things I do, just as a silly bit of nonsense, is I like to eat peanuts with chopsticks because it's a good test of my manual skills. But you don't need to. You can use hands. And if actually you didn't have chopsticks to hand, there's nothing wrong with picking up peanuts with your hand. Certainly an apple. Why would I use chopsticks for an apple? Crisps might be better with chopsticks than knife and fork, in truth. I think the point is that for many of the crows, with the exception of the New Caledonian crows, they don't need tools for the food they eat. New Caledonian crows need tools because they've got to coax the worms out of the bit of bark and the beak isn't long enough to do it. But if you don't need a tool, why would you use one? But the whole idea that in the lab, even in the absence of ever having had experience of tools before, they can spontaneously think, oh, that could be a good device to need what I want. And I would use that then to explore, well, what does that say about how their minds think? And I'd talk about abstract thought and the whole idea that probably one of the most remarkable findings is that they can think about other times and other minds.
The time travel, the mental time travel.
Time travel and theory of mind. So I would start with the tools because it's a physical, obvious thing, and then say, but it's not something they do in the wild. It's not Mother Nature. It's not hardwired. This is something that they're reasoning about, they're thinking about. Well, is there any other evidence that they can think about things that they cannot see? And then I would do the mental time travel, the planning ahead, thinking about other minds in terms of theory of mind. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, for sure. I find the birds pair bonding, the mating, picking a partner for life.
That's stunning too.
Just sitting here as someone, obviously, I'm just kind of like observing your world. And I'm like, you dive in for the moment to think about this and you're like, wow, everything that has to go on. There's the side of me that says, I wish they could talk to me and tell me what they're thinking.
Yeah. So we've got one rook at the moment that we've been training. We've only done one so far because it's more the kind of work that Irene Pepperberg's done with parrots. It's my amazing PhD student, Francesca Canero, but she's been working with one of our rooks, Leonidas, and he's now responding to verbal commands. So you can say come and you can say wait and you can say speak.
This is like dog stuff, right?
Yeah.
Greater than dog. Let's define that too, because you're going to know the answer. If we were to think of the assorted animals out there, animal species out there, what other animals have we do, humans, but what other animals have the ability to pull off what you're describing with the birds? What other animals have that?
Firstly, I would say it's not birds. It's probably corvids and parrots. There may be many other birds, but we don't know. But certainly I don't think some species of birds have these abilities.
It's definitely a certain species that have them. It's not just everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. And I think that's true of mammals too. Humans have things that rats and mice don't possess.
Dolphins, elephants, chimps.
Yeah.
That headspace. Or octopus somewhere in that as well?
The cephalopods, so the octopus and the squid and the cuttlefish, are interesting. And of course, I've been doing quite a lot of work on that as well. They certainly seem to have intellectual capacities that we didn't think they had. I think the human assumption is that other animals don't have what we have. And to some extent, we're right in that assumption. If you want to say, well, no other animal that we know of on the planet can read and write, I can't argue with you. But if we're talking about things like future-oriented decision-making, then the area gets much fuzzier as to which ones have it and which ones don't. The cephalopods seem to have that. They're not on a par with the corvids, I would argue. I would say the corvids and the chimpanzees are similar, but the cephalopods show impressive levels of intelligence, but not to the corvid and chimp level. The corvids and chimps are here. The cephalopods are probably here.
The here you're saying is the top of your head would be for the chimps and the corvids, and your nose would be the cephalopods.
Yeah, they're still a lot higher than down here. My reason for why is that the selection pressures are quite different. Selection pressures for corvids and chimpanzees are probably social. They're long-lived, interact with many individuals with whom there's a requirement that they learn to recognize one another and are able to negotiate with one another. The chimpanzee politics, as Franz Wahl used to refer to it as, and maybe physical in terms of things like the problem solving of extractive foraging. For the cephalopods, it's probably quite different because they don't live very long and they're not social. But the big pressure for them, depending on how you look at it, is social and physical, but it's of a very different kind. It's that you're very tasty and you don't have a shell. Essentially, you're a living lunch. But the kind of problem solving that you have to do to avoid predators is probably quite different socially from the negotiations you have to do long term if you're looking at building and maintaining relationships or working out how to outsmart your competition.
Let me keep you at your corvid, the crow, and the learning words. Where does that end? Do you have an idea of where that ends? What level of vocabulary and understanding you think they can take it to? Do you know yet?
We don't know. Scientifically, I don't have any evidence for what I'm about to say. So it's just an intuition. I think the big difference between the corvids, and I would argue the same with the chimpanzees and human beings, is that they probably don't understand life beyond a lifetime. We're not terribly good at future planning ourselves, but we at least understand that we might need to take action now in order to save the planet for our children or our grandchildren. So we have an understanding that life continues beyond our lifetime.
Chimps don't have that, though, do they?
No, they don't. That's what I'm saying. I don't think chimps or corvids. I'm saying that's probably uniquely human to have that understanding beyond a lifetime and before a lifetime. The whole understanding of history, it's an obvious thing, isn't it? But that's what storytelling, that's what reading and writing gives you. We can read books from centuries ago and resonate with those ideas. But I think without other animals probably can't do that.
Can I take you back in time, like a long time ago? I had somebody on this podcast a while back, Jack Horner, the paleontologist, the T-Rex guy. And so you get me thinking, as we're talking about corvids now, crows now, I guess these are the avian dinosaurs that are still left. It makes me so curious. Okay, you're finding that some birds have this intelligence capability. Okay, if we went back in time hundreds of millions of years ago, would we be looking at the same situation with dinosaurs? Or would there be one or two variety of dinosaurs that had some kind of crazy intelligence like you're finding with corvids? I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? Suppose we were aliens from another planet and we landed on Earth. What would we be looking for in terms of intelligence? Or put it another way, if you're a human being and an alien arrives on the Earth and looks pretty hostile, how would you persuade it, please don't eat me?
It's a kind of like a Twilight Zone TV show question, you know?
Yeah.
So many of those episodes. It's just terribly fascinating what you have uncovered. I asked a second ago, though, but I want you to clarify a little bit more and add a little more context. The corvids, the crows, mating for life. You can know that by observation. You can learn that. They can't tell you what they're thinking. Oh my gosh, my wife is so beautiful. I am never leaving her side. I mean, how that happens, what do we know?
We know very little scientifically, but as a dancer.
Good question. Good question. I love asking someone like you, and you get to tell me we know very little. Yes, yes.
Absolutely. I can answer it as a dancer. I can't answer it as a scientist. As a scientist, what we know is that they tend to pair for life, and they are much more successful in pairs than they are individually. So the dominant status, if you're in a pair, is much greater than if you're on your own. But as a dancer, the analogy I would like to give is with Argentine tango, one of my dance forms. Because what you see is the pairs that have really strong pair bonds have fantastic synchronicity. Two will move as one. And there's a leader and a follower. The leader moves and the follower moves, but the synchronicity with which they do it is fantastic. It is in tango when, as a leader and a follower, usually the leader is a man or a taller partner. They don't have to be, anything goes. It doesn't have to be that way, but it often is. But the two move in synchrony because the leader signals an intention to move so that then they can both move together. Because obviously, if you move and I think, oh, you want me to move, I'll move after you, unless you signal, let's move together. And it's that togetherness that we think is very important in maintaining the pair bond.
And what's interesting about the signaling part, as you contrast it with dance, is this is not stated. This is physical.
Absolutely. It's communicated without words. Yeah.
Which transitions into another aspect of your life, as you brought up the tango. I'll share also, I think it's one of the reasons that I became fascinated with a place like Vietnam, because as a, quote, typical white guy American, to come to this place, I'm like the male corvid. Okay, I was single. Okay, I'm looking around. Okay, I'm staying. But it's a very different, going to be some English, but very little. But the communication for the relationships I've had in Vietnam is often very nonverbal. It's kind of a traditional culture, so it's more endearing in a way. You almost have to think back to being a kid because, yes, as time goes on, there'll be more and more bad things from the West that come in. But for people that have been away from the West in some ways, very smart and everything, but just it's fascinating to watch that dance, so to speak, the dance that I've seen in relationships. You're coming from a Western culture and coming into a more traditional culture. Again, your work really makes me think about so many things that I've lived.
So one of the things I've been doing recently, we've not published that much yet, just 2 papers and 1 submitted, but I've been doing a lot of work. I'm very privileged to have super bright PhD students, and I couldn't do it without them, super bright postdocs, of course. But we've been looking at differences between East Asian and Western cultures in the development of mental time travel and theory of mind, and in adults too, and discovering really interesting things about the influence of I and we cultures, both in terms of when these things develop in young children, also in how parents talk to their children about self and time. And it's really interesting. We focus primarily on Chinese versus British, but I think many of the findings translate to East Asia versus Western cultures.
When I was preparing to talk to you, I was thinking about that I got invited to a then woman in my life. Her grandmother died. I had never been to her hometown. We were already talking marriage, but nothing official yet. This is one of these places you don't go to the hometown until it's go time. But she still wanted me to go because it was her grandmother at a funeral. So I show up and no one there spoke a lick of English. I was the first foreigner that most of her family had ever met. It was all the moments, observation, them observing me observing them. I bring this back to your work, is sometimes we have an over-reliance on words. That 2-day experience, I didn't really need a lot of words to know what was going on, and they could tell with me too. I love these kinds of experiences where you get outside the box, and your whole life is outside the box.
Well, my first fieldwork experience was in the Lesser Sunda Islands in Indonesia, Nusa Tenggara. On most of those islands, they're more touristy now, but this was way back in the late 1980s. And I remember that some of the people, just some of the women that were so affectionate, but they'd pick up my arm. And I'm blonde, so that I hardly have thick hairs or dark hairs or anything, but they would pull their hairs and point to the freckles because that's not something they have.
It's so nice how they do it, though. It takes all of our complicated worry about all this world, and it brings it down to this simple level. These people are genuinely curious about you, you're curious about them, and then it's just fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And teaching me how to wash in the river whilst keeping a sarong on. That was quite an experience as well.
Did you succeed?
I succeeded, but I lost my bar of soap. So did I succeed or not? Question.
Let me bring it back also to, because I know this is another strong part of your career, is this kind of contrast between, how do you say it? I guess pre-speaking human children and developed corvids. So why don't you contrast some of that and some of the insights and findings that you have pulled out? I think I told you in email that one of the ladies that I had on this show a while back, who I just loved her insights, was Alison Gopnik.
Yeah.
And you obviously know about her, or maybe know her.
We collaborate on something.
Yeah, see, small world.
Small world, yeah. Causal reasoning without words.
Her concept of the Basian babies is just fabulous. I mean, I just love that. Speak to some of the insights that you've pulled together, because obviously this has been a real passion of yours.
Well, again, it's about how do you think without words? Now, I say without words rather than without language, simply because I want to make the analogy with dance. And I certainly don't think dancers lack language, far from it. But also in young children, they're developing language, depending on what age you get them at. It's before words are fully developed. And obviously in the birds, they don't have words at all, and they don't have language. So it's looking at, we know language shapes the way in which we think. There are many beautiful cultural examples of that. Paraha tribe in Amazonia with very few words for numbers, or contrast between the Western world and people, for example, in, say, Thailand, Mexico, that use absolute frames of reference for space rather than relative. We can see how that shapes the way we think. But the question is language critical for what we think about? Looking at young children who have the capacity for language, but for whom the words aren't fully developed, and looking at very clever animals like corvids that don't have a capacity for language, they don't have words, and looking at how they think. That's what interests me.
How do you go ahead when, this is so fascinating, it makes me think about memory and what are first memories for us young kids before we have the ability of language. How much work has been done to understand our communication at that age pre-language? Is the intelligence, I mean, obviously the experience is not there, so that hinders us, but speak to what kind of intelligence we have been able to understand about us Homo sapiens before we have the gift of gab.
a lot is known about the way in which young babies interact with the physical world. And we know that there's a huge developmental process that they don't do very much when they're first born. And then as their eyes develop, they are capable of more and more. And of course, there are fascinating studies with twins where you realize that they're developing their own complex communication with one another long before it can be shared with the adult human world. Complex behavioral transition, I think.
What intrigues me too is and now I just want to do this. I wish I could dip into your world and play for a couple of years, but to observe children at that age where language is not being used far enough away from the womb. So they're almost there. But I think about you and your career, it'd be so fascinating to kind of like start to try to understand how they communicate with each other. Because I could think back to watching my nephews and niece and when they were that age, and clearly there was so much going on where everyone's busy and it's like, oh, the kids are over here doing something. But what do you speak to that? What do we know about at that early age? I don't know what I'm talking, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, before language is hit, but children are clearly developing their personality, how they do things, but they're not yet speaking. What do we know about their communication with each other?
I don't know how much we know really, any more than how much we know about the way in which crows communicate without words, because I think that probably as adult humans with sophisticated linguistic skills, language is great, but it probably blinds us to some of the fascinating observations that we'd otherwise have. Because the moment we talk to one another, we listen to the words, we pay less attention to the complex behavioral interactions. You only have to see that with very simple psychological tests like the Stroop test, where you're told, say, the colour, not the word, and the word might be written in red, but the word actually says black. And you have to ignore black and say the colour red, and so on and so forth. And many studies have shown that you're much more likely to make those mistakes in your first language if you're bi or trilingual than you are in other languages, because the language overshadows the thoughts that you have. And yet, on the other hand, the moment where anybody does something that you're a bit like, I'm not sure I believe that, then immediately we turn to their behaviour. So if a politician's on the TV and you're like, I don't trust you, the moment they do anything dodgy, you're like, I'm not sure I'm really convinced by what she's saying, right?
As you go down this path, you're making me think back to your story about being in Indonesia. I'm guessing you spoke no language there.
A tiny bit,
right? But you're having to interact and deal within the culture. I don't know if enough people truly appreciate how much fun and how interesting that is to do, because I know I've experienced it here. If you were to tell somebody why that's such an amazing experience to be in a place where almost nobody knows what you're saying, why is that so cool? Why would that be something that you would say to people, you should really try that at one point in your life? It would be fun.
Because it allows you to focus on behavior in a way you wouldn't normally do. You have to forget all the reading and writing skills that we have, all the speaking skills we have, and just look at behavior. You're not speaking to me at all right now, but I can tell from your body language you're interested in my answer. You're not going, whatever. You're leaning forwards, right? There's so many behavioural signals that we can pick up on, and often we miss because we can use language and the language often blinds us. And some of the work that I do with Clive Wilkins, who's artist in residence in the department, we look at thinking beyond words and we use magic effects. He's a member of the Magic Circle as an example of that, because so often a magician can do things with their hands and they can tell you a story, but actually the story in their mind is quite different from the story they want you to experience. And so much of that is actually behavioural. The words are actually a distraction to what's really going on. We've been applying that also to the birds, by the way. We haven't got to the cephalopod yet. Give us time. It's new.
I'll add to that example in the sense that I don't know how many people listening have had this experience. I can say that I have, but okay, if there is a physical relationship between two people that have no ability to speak at all, they don't understand each other's language, but there is an attraction that can get physical, that is truly a fascinating experience too. Because then you're like, okay, well, hold on, it's man, woman, and if there's a connection, okay, you don't speak, I don't speak, well, we really don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to share thoughts through language, and that's why art is so powerful in so many ways. Most paintings don't have words on them, or if they do, it's not really about the words. This is not a pipe, but it's really not about the words.
I love the word artist. In fact, that's what I would describe myself as, even though somebody might look at me and say, because I just wake up each day and I say, well, what can I create? What can I do today? Even like today, this is a podcast, but I have to do my level-headed best to not being an expert in your field, to pull good stuff out of you, to try and make it interesting, right? It's one version of my life that I consider a form of art. But I think if more people thought of their lives as being artists, they could have a more interesting time, because art is not work.
Well, for me, art and science are about ideas rather than work. At every level, we have to work if work means do stuff. If work means earn a living, then it's a more complicated argument. But I think that both of them are about ideas. And I think as a species, Homo sapiens, we have a drive to share ideas with others because we're social. I would say the same is true of the Corvids as well. But I think sharing of ideas is key, but it doesn't have to be done linguistically. And it certainly doesn't have to be done with words.
I could think back to Stanley Kubrick's 2001, with like the first 30 minutes was not a word.
Yeah. Probably my favourite film, actually, is La Jetée. It's only 30 minutes and it's all silent, and it's mainly a series of stills rather than an actual film. But it's so powerful. It's what inspired Chris Marker's film, La Jetée. It's what inspired Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys. But it's so powerful. It's all about mental time travel in various ways, but it's imagery. And I suppose for me, the idea is that what the crows have and what chimpanzees have, but not to the same level as we humans, because they don't do it before and beyond their lifetime, is this sharing of ideas and this imagery, this ability to imagine futures that haven't happened and may never happen except in the mind's eye.
Let me keep you at one last little question. Maybe it's a big question. Is curiosity to know, is that your prime driver? Is that what makes you wake up each day? Because it's not like, okay, they're going to say, well, here, we're going to pay you for this job. No, you have found a way in your life to be curious about something and the things that you want to be curious about. And so far, other people are willing to pay you to go down your own curiosity path. Fair?
I think it's a combination. I'm not sure how much these words differ, actually, but it's curiosity and it's wonder. And I suppose I use the word wonder because I think that curiosity means I'd just like to know. Wonder is the delight that ensues from that curiosity. It's like the light bulb's gone all sparkly and twinkly. I'm like, here are ideas. Oh, they're amazing, aren't they? That's what I mean.
If there's one thing on your list with the Corvids, with the crows, that you could figure out, and we all have limited time, on your limited time on this planet, until we come up with life extension, what is the one thing that you would love to know?
Oh, that's a really tough one, isn't it?
This is my job, to make very accomplished scientists stumble and think through and make them feel like, oh my gosh, why did he ask me that hard question?
Yeah. I would like to know, to what extent is episodic like memory really like episodic memory? So to put that in non-scientific jargon, I mean, to what extent is having the behavioral phenomenon of thinking, okay, they can remember what happened, where and when, they have these behavioral abilities, really like phenomenological experience that we have because of language, of questioning what we know?
Meaning, do they have a language perhaps in their mind, they just can't verbalize it?
Without words, yeah. So, for example, there's a wonderful saying, you don't remember what happened. What you remember becomes what happened. Do animals actually have those kinds of thoughts in the absence of language?
What's your guess?
My guess is yes, you can have that without language, so long as you have imagery. I suppose the example I'd give there would be boundary extension, which is where you see an image, see a photograph, say. Typically, it might be a picket fence and a dustbin, boring scene. You see that, and then the screen goes blank. And then you're shown a number of scenes, maybe 12, and they all look pretty similar. They're all picket fence and a dustbin, but some are slightly zoomed in and some are slightly zoomed out. So you see more of the boundary or less of the boundary. And we think the one we've seen is the one that's slightly zoomed out because the brain naturally fills in the gap. That is, if we have a healthy memory. If we're amnesic, we don't do that. We don't fill in the gaps. But that would be one way of looking at the power of the imagination, that we don't actually remember precisely what we saw. We embellish it to make sense of it within the context of our actual world. I think that would be interesting to know whether they could do that. I don't know how to test it. Give me a few years.
Hey, very cool stuff. Is there any place you want to send people to? The university website? Is there a personal website would you like to direct people to?
Yeah, the Captured Thought would be great. It's www.thecapturedthought.com.
Obviously, I could keep playing around and pick you for a long time, pick on your mind and get you to give us insights. But thank you for taking some time today. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Mike.
No big intro, my guest today. Tom Basso has appeared many times on this podcast. A favorite guest of just about everyone. I actually have at this very moment a new book out about Tom called Trend Following Mindset. You might want to check that out. Tom and I just appeared on a webinar, an event in Singapore, hosted by Colin Seow. Colin, a friend of mine for a long time. He's had me speak at many events in Singapore. And this was kind of all over the map and quite fun with Tom. So sit back and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Tom Basso, one that was kindly hosted by Colin Seow in Singapore. Please enjoy. I noticed that Tom liked something on my Facebook in the last 24 hours, and I want to read what he liked. It was a tweet or something that I quoted from a guy named Parik Patel, CFA, looks like an Indian guy, so CFA, and he said on this tweet, the best performing assets of 2021 are, number one, a failing video game retailer, number two, a cinema chain close to bankruptcy, and number three, a dog-themed cryptocurrency. Now, in most parts of the investing world, people might start laughing, and even in the trend following world, we might start laughing. But I have a sneaky suspicion that when Tom saw that, yes, he might have chuckled, but he said to himself, I don't care what those things are, I could trade them. Is that fair, Tom?
That's fair. I actually like the whole thing because it sort of shows a little bit of the absurdity of the markets that we trade when things can get so ridiculous that They're literally losing money, have no sensible financial future, that the world's changing. I mean, you get Netflix right into your own home. Why do you want to go and pay for a family of four, $50 to $100 with popcorn and candy and go to see the movie and, the big gulps of soda, all of which is bad for you healthy wise. I don't know, it just seems, and here we have AMC, being run up by memes. I don't know, very bubbly.
Well, but here's the key thing about that, though, and where I'm really trying to go with that is that even if they are memes, even if they are bubbly, if you didn't know the name of those markets, Tom, you could trade them. You could trade them.
I know people who are traders that are completely systematic they had no idea why those stocks were going up. They just jumped in on them and they made a ton of money.
That's a great place to start. I find, at least for us to break apart our subject today, I find one of the most interesting confusions, especially with new traders and even the most experienced people, is the word trend. And I kind of look at it like, and I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit from Ed Seykota, but you really don't know a trend until it's over, because then you've got an endpoint, you've got a beginning point and an endpoint. So it's kind of like even the word trend following, it's kind of a misnomer a little bit. Why don't you explain to the audience your view of the word trend?
Okay, to me, there's two parts of all the data that you get in price information. So you've got the quote machines, in comes a lot of prices. There's noise, which to me is the little sideways nonsense that if you sat there all day, you would be completely mesmerized by all the activity. But really, when you look at the beginning of the day, the end of the day, it might not even gone anywhere. That's noise. At some point, the prices move sufficiently through the noise and start going beyond what is normal noise. So you could measure normal noise a number of different ways. You could say, what's one standard deviation off of an average? Or what's a Keltner band top and bottom off of an average? Or what is a Donchian channel top and bottom of the last 21 days or whatever? Each of those is allowing room for noise to be there and a trend to evolve out of it. So once it evolves out of the noise, I consider it a trend. It may be a one-day trend and turn around and go back into the noise, but for that one day, it was a trend. At that point, I'm on and away we go. And, you hope for a long run.
Let me let you expand on the idea of you hope for a long run. When people make a typical entry, if they don't necessarily understand trend following, they like to try to predict how long that run's going to go. That's not your game, is it?
Mm-mm. I once heard Ed Seykota, actually, to quote him again, say to a question from the audience one time, he said something about, what's your objective when you get into a trade, Ed? And he said, well, I'm a trend follower, so my objective is for it to go to the moon. I've never had one go there yet, but I keep hoping. That's exactly his answer. That was so funny. The whole audience laughed, of course. But that's really true. When you get in on a trend, it could be a one-day trend. It could be the next year and a quarter. I had, back in Trendset days, I remember a famous Japanese yen trade that all I did was roll it every 3 months on futures. I was in on it for like a year and a quarter. Japanese yen went from like 150 to 75 or something. It was amazing. It was very, very profitable.
Let me keep you brought up the phrase one day trend. And I know you're not a day trader per se or anything like that. But, one of the most, and I want to talk about time frame a little bit here, since we have a lot of new traders on, and perhaps those new traders are in their 20s or 30s. And maybe they look at my age, they look at your age, and they say, oh my God, I don't know those guys can't help us at all. I don't know what they know. And they might be thinking to themselves, when I finish this chat with Mike and Tom, I'm going to get back to, day trading my 1 minute bars with candlesticks. I have to tell you, Tom, I don't know if you hear this, but during the lockdown period, I fielded more questions from people. They'll tell me that they're having trouble with their stops or their psychology or whatever. And I always say, well, what trading strategy are you using? I'm telling you, 9 times out of 10 today, people literally tell me they are trading 1-minute bar candlesticks. And I just want to pull my hair out, whatever little hair I have left.
Yeah, well, you could argue that I suppose even at 1-minute levels, there are trends.
You're not arguing that.
I personally, I have to prune my bushes and play golf and work out and cook dinner and do a bunch of things that I like to do. I'm not going to sit in front of a computer watching 1-minute bars all day. That's not my style.
Let me let you expand on that, though, because it really is something where a lot of people are starting to think they can trade this way. Maybe we could offer a little bit of insight as to who they are up against. They're up against trading desks with millions upon millions of dollars worth of equipment. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Jim Simons, go read his book. I mean, to compete at that level is that's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. I suppose there's ways to duck around some of it, but I think the tough part isn't really even competing against the others, because the market gets so deep and so many people are so small compared to the big guys that you could probably duck in and out here and there. However, I find the biggest challenge anytime I have tried to dabble with any kind of day trading or short-term trading is the biggest challenge is yourself, the ability to be disciplined, the ability to be able to go to the bathroom every now and again, to grab lunch, to handle the phone call that comes in the middle of nowhere and distracts you, and then you miss your trade. And there's just so many ways that it can go bad. It's very, very difficult from that standpoint. If I wait till the end of the trading day and run my 30 minutes or so of process, I'm trading now 8 different strategies with all sorts of different time periods. All of them have an aspect of trend following to them, but some are very shorter term. And the shorter term, I mean like 9 days, stuff like that, less than a month. Some of the stuff goes out to 50 days and is very long term. But I can do those 30 days or 30 minutes at the end of the day. And then at that point, I'm done for 24 hours. I've got stops covering everything. I have no problems. I smile on my face, go hit some golf balls or something. And I think that's what a lot of people don't design their trading strategy around, really who they are, what their capabilities are, what their talents are, what their, computer expertise, math expertise. They want to ask me what I do, and then they want to copy me. And I keep telling them, you can't do what I do. I mean, I can do what I do because I'm me. And I have my amount of money, and I have my risk tolerance, and I have my skill levels, and I designed everything I did around me. If Michael designs a strategy for himself, I probably would be uncomfortable doing what he's doing because he's designed what he does for him. And I think that's the lesson that I'd like to always get across to people is think about who you are and what you're trying to do and design what you need to do to get the job done. You have a different financial puzzle that you're trying to solve than the financial puzzle that Michael or myself are solving for ourselves.
You're going one place that I think you're being pretty diplomatic about, because you are known as a guy with a serene approach. And I think a lot of people find that admirable. You keep saying you retire, but I'm not so sure these days. But so,
some days I'm not so sure either.
A lot of people
11:30 at night doing a time.
A lot of people find that serenity admirable. And so as we talk about something like, 1-minute bar trading, I think yes, you might not want to tell people what to do per se, but there is a lot to be learned from your experience in terms of enjoying a life. Because ultimately, I don't think anybody wants to be glued to a screen, unable to go to the bathroom with their entire fortune on the line on 1-minute bars. I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that you've approached life.
You are maximizing your stress if you try to do that. You are pushing every possible button mentally that you can push, and you better be awfully darn good at what you're doing to pull that off and do it consistently for a long, long period of time. Most people like that burn out after a year or two, 10 maybe tops. I mean, I had all sorts of friends in the industry that ended up in alcohol rehab and drug rehab, or left the industry and went into real estate and did all sorts of stuff. Meanwhile, I went all the way till I was 51 and had a 28-year run. And I think that's a little bit about the stress levels, about understanding yourself very well. I mean, being self-aware, being able to be disciplined about what you do, think through what you're trying to do and accomplish ahead of time so it doesn't stress you out when certain things happen. And I think that's where quality of life can truly exist with trading, but you have to plan for it and really think about what constitutes serenity to you. And you know, a lot of people might not like my retirement because I'm a very busy guy. I love doing a lot of things. I don't love traveling a whole lot. A lot of people, when they retire, want to travel. I traveled all my life, so I want to stay at home. But you know, I think that there's a lot to be said for just thinking through, what do you want your life to look like? And if you're going to be a trader, all right, that's fine. But trading shouldn't be your entire life. That should be your trading job or whatever, and for X amount of hours a day. But you've got family, you've got maybe a spouse, you've maybe got hobbies, you've maybe got sleep, eating, working out, all sorts of other stuff. That's got to be part of life too. And I think so many people just sort of shove that aside and they become one-dimensional and they call themselves a trader. And a lot of people label me as a trader, but you know, I only do 30 minutes a day. So does that mean I'm more of a golfer than I am a trader? Well, not really, because I'm just a hack, 10 handicap or something. But to me, I think that's where people just jump in and they get addicted with trading and they forget about the rest of their life and it gets squeezed. It gets shortchanged basically. And I think that's sad.
I think what you're really getting at there too is ego and efficiency, meaning who cares if you call yourself a trader or not? But the idea is, how can you efficiently use this game of the markets to potentially make you wealth over the course of a lifetime? That's really what it's about. I mean, I think people running around on social media, banging their chest and screaming they're a trader, I mean, a lot of them are probably anything but a trader. You know?
Yeah, they're probably gamblers that want to call themselves traders that haven't figured out yet, and the quality of their life might not be as good as they would like it to be, and they can't figure out. I mean, everybody thinks, okay, I'm going to trade, I'm going to get rich, and then I can have a nice life like Tom Basso or Michael Covel or whatever. But I think that's a little short-sighted. You have to plan for these things and try to figure out what really, you know, you don't want my exact life. You want your life that you seek. And so what does that mean? And how much time can you spend trading? Maybe some people can spend 6 hours a day trading and still have a very nice life when they're not trading. For me, it's a half an hour. That's my limit. Beyond a half an hour, I start getting mad at myself for taking on more strategies than I'm able to efficiently process. So then I kind of cut stuff out, or I automate it, or I do something and get it back to a half an hour. So I'm willing to spend a half an hour. Beyond that, I get tired of sitting at a desk.
So Tom won't say it, but I will implore everyone listening, do not take the direction of sitting at a screen for 6 hours a day like you're at an autopilot. You know, go for the half hour. Take that lesson. Let me put up a chart. I don't know if everyone can see this.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the lumber chart, right, from this year. And so the cash price is down 51% from the all-time high of 1515 back in May 28. You know, so that's a topical chart for 2021. But that particular chart, that up and down nature, that huge drop, Tom, that's absolutely nothing abnormal in the course of market history, is it?
Nope. And I caught both sides of it.
Let's explain that, because you did not wake up in 2021 or even going back into 2020, you did not wake up one day and say, "Oh my gosh, I've been studying the lumber market. I've been going to Sheets and Lowe's and Home Depot, and I've been tracking the tree cut downs." You didn't do any of this stuff, but here you are, Tom Basso, the retired golfer, training for 30 minutes a day, who rode the lumber market trend up and down. Now, for those listening that are not familiar with trend following, they might be saying, "What in blazes? No, he's some secret savant." You could be. I think you probably are a savant, but you're not a secret You're not a secret lumber savant. So,
no, I'm not.
Why do you?
I had no idea.
Let's explain how that happened. How you could possibly trade lumber and make a lot of money.
Put the chart up there again, and I'll explain through the chart. All right, look at the left side of the chart. It's noise. It's going sideways. It's not going anywhere. So you could buy and sell that all you want, but you're not going to make a ton of money because it's just noise. But at some point, as we get past January, sometime in the 2020 region, you get that first little hump up. That's now breaking out of that noise. You get a buy signal. You end up long lumber contracts. You may even get sold out in that little dip down, but then would probably get back in someplace. And I did. And then you ride it all the way up. I mean, in the right side of the chart where it's going up to that peak, it's limit up every day for, 5, 6, 7 days in a row. And you're making, for one contract, every one contract was about $7,000, $8,000 a day. And then it turns around. Well, it turns around, the trend goes to the downside. So you short it and then you write it down. And
Tom, what told you that the trend was going to go like this? How did you know it was going to go up and down like that, Tom?
In the end, I didn't know at the time, but when it broke out of the noise, it triggered a trend. So I say, okay, if the trend's up, I got to go long. I didn't know it was going to go that far.
Zero fundamental understanding of the lumber market.
I had about 5, 6 days into it when I'm coining all this money. I'm wondering what the heck's going on with lumber. That's kind of weird. We're that's driving my portfolio practically. It's really doing well, but I had no idea. And then I started hearing rumblings about, well, there's all these cargo ships out in LA harbor trying to get into the harbor and they can't unload them. And, meanwhile, everybody's trying to get out of their city and go build a house someplace, and they can't find the lumber to build a house. So there's more demand and there's less supply. The prices are shooting up. I was like, that sounds good, but
none of that was affecting you. That was just watching the news and seeing what's going on.
Yeah, it's me after the fact sort of explaining why I look so brilliant buying lumber. But at the time I did it, I had no clue whatsoever.
I hope everyone understands, and I know for some new traders, maybe new investors, they might not yet understand this lumber example and the depth of how important it is. But if Tom can trade lumber up and down and make a bloody fortune, he's saying that he can trade anything up and down as long as it's liquid. It's an exchange you can trust and all that kind of stuff. And can everyone imagine what a superpower that is? That you do not have to have the MBA, you don't have to have the CFA, you don't have to have any kind of fundamental knowledge. You don't have to know that a Home Depot exists. And you can trade lumber or a cryptocurrency or gold or stocks or whatever. Sometimes, just to quickly add here, and I'll let Tom expand, often people get fixated on their home country. They only want to say, well, I'm Australian. What markets can I trade in Australia? I'm Singaporean. What markets can I trade in Singapore? Look, if Tom can trade lumber up and down, you can extrapolate out that you can trade anything up or down, and you're not limited by a geographical border.
That's correct. I mean, I was just looking at an Interactive Brokers site a while back, and I happened to notice that they had a little tab there that said, here's all the places that we are. And I'm not doing an ad for Interactive Brokers, but I happen to notice that they have places in London and Europe, Singapore. They have, of course, the United States. They have South America. They have Australia. I think Hong Kong. They're all over the place. I mean, they've got separate companies, but all tied to the same interactive brokers computer systems. And, the world's getting to be a small place with all these computers out there.
I'm going to jump in and grab some questions here as we keep talking, just to make it interesting. I
Sure.
see one name going under the name Wonder Woman, and I'm not sure Wonder Woman. I'm not. Look, it's the modern age. I'm not going to make any assumptions here. So it says, Tom, what signposts do you look at for the Fed to taper bond purchases and/or raise interest rates? When do you see the timing for such events materializing? I'm going to let you answer, but I'm thinking, hold on. Have you been listening to what we're talking about?
My personal view of interest rates is driven by the bond futures contracts that I trade. So if the Fed is starting to taper, I'm liable to be short Treasury bond futures. And I don't know how many times it'll take me being short Treasury bond futures until the Fed really actually tries to lighten up on the free money and makes the interest rates go up. But that'll be the trigger that I'll look for, is that the long-term Treasuries will start dropping, and I'll be short.
But you're looking at that in the price data, not some macro analysis of Fed actions.
Nope. Exactly right. The price action will happen. There'll be tons of smart people that are a lot smarter than me that'll try to figure this thing out, and they'll move vast quantities of billions of dollars, which I don't have. And so I'm just going to go along for the ride. I'm just going to be monitoring it. When it breaks out of the noise to the downside, I'll be short, and that'll be the start of the process. Months from then, maybe we'll find out, the Fed had started tapering. I won't try to anticipate it at all. I won't try to predict it.
I should add something here as we talk. I first heard about Tom, and I think we've talked about this before on my podcast, that we met in 1996 in Berlin, but I don't think it was like an official meeting or something. But anyways, I read about Tom for the first time in Jack Schwager's The New Market Wizards book, which I highly recommend that book and Jack's first book. Actually, I recommend almost all of Jack's Market Wizards books, if not all. I'm not sure if I've seen them all. I think I have, but it's a great chapter on Tom in the New Market Wizards book. And so, when I started my podcast years ago, I knew Tom was retired, but then I don't know, through the magic of social media, next thing I knew that Tom was on my podcast, a first time, a second time, a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. And then I was like, one day we started talking and I was like, well, Tom, what if I can do a book about you? And so, a lot of the things that we're talking about today in much greater depth through a combination of our prior interviews and some of Tom's research is in, just to share with everyone, this new book about Tom. And look at that cool cowboy hat. And look at that guy back there, huh? Come on. Yeah. I'm telling you, just for the cover. And look, that's my cheap sales pitch for the moment. But Tom, let's talk about this idea, big picture of trend following. And I often make the comparisons to, look, we've got Moneyball out there, we've got venture capital, the way people finance films. And, we've hinted at this somewhat, but the reason you're able to trade lumber successfully is not because you were only trading lumber. It was one of several things that you were looking at. Why don't you expand upon the diversification and portfolio part of this?
Sure. For instance, in early 2000, during the COVID crash, I made a ton of money off of palladium. Now, if you look at my profits or losses from palladium over a long period of time, there could be years where you lose money trading palladium as a trend follower. It just is in the noise band. It's just, you're getting whipsawed. There's nothing happening there. Meanwhile, lumber kicks into gear and becomes a big winner through the end of 2000 and early 2001 with the run up and the run down. So I never know where my next winner is going to be. I have no idea. And I don't sit there and study the fundamentals of everything from gold, platinum, palladium, silver to, crude oil, natural gas to cocoa and all the other things that I trade, lumber, orange juice. I mean, there's no way I have enough time in the day to fit that into my half an hour that I've allotted to trading. So, but what I can do is I can bring in a whole lot of prices, and I can look at 20 or 25 markets, and they can be widely diversified. I mean, orange juice really doesn't care what live cattle is doing, and live cattle doesn't care what gold is doing. You know, they're true diversifications. So they're going to have their own day in the sun and their own day in the doghouse. My job is to just filter the noise, see the breakout, go with it, up, down, and then, 6 months later, I can look back and tell you perhaps fundamentally why that happened. But, at the time, I have no clue. I just go with it.
At what age did you understand what you just said? How old were you when you first understood what you just said?
It was about after 4 or 5 years of struggling to make a profit as a commodity trader, having had made profits, nice profits in the stock market in the US. It would have been during the 70s, probably right about the time 1980 rolled around, which would have made me 52, do the math, it would be 28 years old, roughly 29 years old.
So 40 years plus, you have used this philosophy, this mindset, and this trading technique. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that think, things go out of style, they go out of fashion, they go out of vogue. And here you are basically saying, if we could go back in time, Mike Myers and, Austin Powers, if we could go back in time, you would be telling me this same thing if I was interviewing you at age 28.
Yeah, with a lot less nuance to it, perhaps, but and maybe not quite as, at that point, I would probably have been thinking I'm right, but I wonder. But now I kind of done 40 years of it, and do you realize that I ran Trendstat for 28 years, and now I've been retired something like 18 years now, I guess, and I'm still using the same buy-sell engine that we used at Trendstat 40 years ago.
I mean, that's just
that we created there.
I really want the audience to think about that for a second. In a day and age where everybody thinks the shiny new amulet is the most important thing, the latest and greatest. I must have this. I must have that. And Tom is telling us he uses a buy-sell engine that's 40 years in the running, and he looks at prices for 30 minutes a day. Now, if somebody else right now listening is, using a new strategy every 5 minutes and is looking at the screen for 8 hours a day, Tom might not tell you that you're wrong. He might be nice and say, okay, you can give it a shot, and I'm going to tell you you're bloody crazy.
Yeah. That's more your style, which I think is a good one too. But for me, I wouldn't count out a person who really was committed to that for some reason. But personally, you're never going to get me to do it. And that's why some of the stuff I do is so long-term compared to today's fast-moving, half-paced society that I'm outside the noise with my transactions. The noise just is ignored by me, and yet everybody else is trying to make money in that noise, and they've got to work hard to do it, and they're competing against some very big computers and smart people. I kind of dance around that a little bit by just being so long term that nobody cares. I care, but
somebody puts
I'm
a question.
Outside. Yeah,
someone puts a question up and they say, aren't we all trend traders till the reversal? And I think I understand why he is saying that. Aren't we all trend traders till the reversal? Except you are planning from the get-go that there will be a reversal, whereas a lot of people might get in and they never ponder a reversal.
Or they a lot of times limit their gains by setting limits. I mean, that's like the old question to Ed of where do you set your target when you get into a trade? I don't set a target. There's some trades, if you're doing real short-term trading, maybe it makes sense to set some targets for a part of your position, maybe to break even a lot, maybe get your reliabilities up. You can cheat the systems a little bit mathematically by selling off part of your position into the trend and then holding on to the rest of it to purely trend follow it, I suppose. And that does get your reliabilities up a little bit. But, in the end, you got to buy low, sell high. There's a trend. You can't get from, if the price goes buy this price and sell at the same price, you didn't make any money. You got to have a trend to go from point A to point B to make a profit. So as far as I'm concerned, if I can pull out the middle part of that trend, miss the top a little bit, miss the bottom, but if the trend in between is big enough, you're going to make a sizable profit.
Someone else is asking about trading the trend of news, the FOMC, the CPI. I don't think we can belabor the point of price action trading enough, because I do think, and I've seen this over the years, that even though we're presenting right now and we're talking about price action based trading, trend following, it is terribly confusing for people, because I think most people have a really difficult time imagining that all of those news programs, all of that fundamental information, all of those talking heads, that they are useless. They just can't imagine, because they're thinking, well, hold on, Mike is some cocky guy over in Saigon, and Tom's just a nice guy, and maybe he's a little crazy or something. But I mean, they don't understand that all this news is so important. But it truly is. It's when you can believe that the news is not valuable for your trading, it's a wonderful feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, it could even be valuable in a weird way. Sometimes if I'm in the mood and I want to actually sit here because I've got other paperwork I'm doing or computer work I'm doing, so I want to watch the markets, I'll turn on the television, I'll turn on the business news, and I'll turn off the voice. And then I just look over and I look at their faces. And if everybody's smiling and looks giddy, I'm thinking this thing's about ready to fall apart. We ought to be nervous. And if on the other side, they're all very serious and they're looking back and forth like this to the quote machines, and they're saying it's down this, and they get furrowed brows and stuff, that's probably a time to get interested in buying, because they're so nervous. It means we're having a panic sell-off or something. So news can be interesting in the opposite way that you might think. But the other thing I was going to say about that question that is interesting, think about what gets into price. All those people, those smart people on Wall Street and around the world, are looking at the Fed and looking at interest rates and looking at the economy and the GDPs and all these things. And they're brilliant minds. And they've got big computers. They've got lots of money. They got staffs. All right. So they make a decision to do something. It goes into a position. It affects price. So everybody everywhere, the ultimate destination they end up is buying or selling. And the net result of that is the price moves. So if I can just measure the price, I've already collectively looked at all of that stuff without looking at it, is the way I look at it. It's as simple as that. I'm looking at the dependent variable from all this independent junk out there that is not really junk. That's not true. It's appropriate to plan an economy and do smart things economically. I wish governments did that more than they seem to do. But whatever they do, it affects prices. And if I'm just measuring prices, I've got the dependent variable under my control, sort of, and I can deal with it.
So a long time ago, Ronald Reagan said of Mikhail Gorbachev, trust but verify. Yeah. So I implore the audience to trust what you say, right? Mm-hmm. But explain how what you just described, how did you figure it out all those years ago? I mean, look, historically, people can see books. It's in my books, but some of the influences and early pioneers. But how did you, Tom, figure it out? Because I think if you can explain how you figured it out, that might give people listening a good way to verify the words that you're saying today.
I'll tell you how it happened. I was sitting as an engineer with a fellow engineer at lunch at a chemical company I worked at back in the 70s. And we were doing point and figure charting by hand on graph paper. And we were in an investment club together. And he said, Tom, and this guy's now passed away. He would have been about 101 now. He just passed away at 99. And he said, Tom, what makes you think, with all these smart people on Wall Street and these new computers that people are getting, and because they were just starting to get into IBM mainframes and stuff back in those days when dinosaurs roamed the earth, he said, what makes you think you can keep up with all these smart people? And I said, it got me thinking about it, and I had to come up with an answer. So I thought, Pete, I tell you how I think, because all these smart people are going to have to take a lot of time to do everything they're doing. And in the end, they're going to have to buy or sell. And as soon as they buy or sell, I'm going to pick up on what they're doing, and I'm going to go with it. And I'm going to be just slightly right behind them. But if there's any kind of major move, I'm going to ride the bulk of it just like they will. That's how I'm going to beat them. And my cost structure is minimal, and my speed is fast, and I can reproduce it systematically. So I think I can beat them.
Did you have the same psychological even keel at that age?
Hell no. I was overly caffeinated. I would go through 2 pots of coffee a day. Sometimes in the afternoon, I could feel my heart skipping a beat. I finally had a day where I was way, way ahead of time for an airplane I had to catch from St. Louis to Phoenix. I'll never forget. And I was on Highway 270 in west side of St. Louis, coming up over a hill. And I looked down at my speedometer, and I'm 10 over the speed limit. And I'm looking at the side for any kind of speed traps or anything. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm clenching the wheel. I've got an hour to kill after I get to the airport. What the heck am I doing? And then I realized that we had made some coffee while I was packing my bags back at the house. And I had downed a few cups, and I was just completely caffeinated. That was the last time I had coffee for years. All of a sudden, this calm came over me, and I realized, wow, that was a hell of a drug, because now I'm so peaceful. And you tell you what, when you're caffeinated, you tend to grab onto stuff. So if a market moves, or if you got a news item comes out, it grabs your attention quickly. When you're not as hardwired, what you tend to find is that news item hits you, and then you think of alternatives. Yeah, but that means this, or, I can choose to ignore that. That's probably not going to really make much of a difference. You expand your opportunities and your possibilities, I think, a little bit more with your brain. And so I've tried to stay fairly decaffeinated. I will have an iced tea for lunch now, nowadays. Now and then, especially if I'm going to work out. I do some green tea, actually, and that has got some caffeine in it. I don't do it all day long like I used to.
Hey, let me take you back to something you were saying about putting on the news with no sound. I want to make sure it's clear that even though you could sense some psychological advantage, perhaps, that if they were too excited or too depressed, that's not part of your buy-sell engine, correct?
Not at all.
Right.
But if I want to be amused by it, I kind of enjoy seeing these people get all freaked out, and meanwhile I'm sitting there probably making money watching the market crash, and I'm short or something, and I'm looking over there at the television, and they're all frazzled. It's kind of just entertainment to me. I don't use it to do anything with. No.
Another question I saw on here, which I think is a fair question. I'll give the answer, and I'll let you expand on the answer. At least I think this is the same answer you're going to give. The question is how do we take a profit? And the answer would be your stop gets hit.
Stop gets hit. You just keep moving the stop. So as a trend matures, you're going to still have ups and downs day to day. Lumber didn't go exactly straight to the top and then turn around and go straight exactly down. It even wandered around for a few days up there. During that wandering around, you got more noise. So you got a noise band. When it breaks out of the noise band, you short. That's how I do it. As sooner or later, as you move the stops up, it reaches a point where the market starts going the other way, hits your stop, you're out.
Tom, what's been your impression? And I think anyone that's listened so far is probably going to have an idea of where you're going to go in the answer. But what's been your impression of crypto? I think it's pretty crazy looking and pretty bubblicious and all that kind of fun stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just a mass of people that are making bets and pushing trends one way or the other. Right. And I guess if you feel comfortable that you can get in and out without too much slippage and some sense of normalcy, then why not? It's just, even if it's a crazy, I mean, look, there's the dog coin or the Doge coin or whatever they're calling it. And look, there's some X-rated named coins that people are making a lot of money on. It's absolutely crazy. But the crazy part doesn't really mean anything if it's a market and it's moving and you can trade it, right?
Right, exactly. I think my concern over Bitcoin and all that is the liquidity. It's the cost of doing the trade, whether it be bid ask or commission charges, if there are those types of things. It's safekeeping of the assets and those types of things. What I have just done, 5 days ago perhaps, is I have used a futures contract, and I'm doing the micro futures contract. So it's the little baby Bitcoin futures contract. And I've got one contract that I'm actually developed a shorter term strategy for it. It'll put a stop in. I'm just going to see where I get filled just for the fun of it. It's so small it won't affect me. So I'm just dabbling right now and trying to get some experience level. But yeah, there's a lot of price movement, and price movement means potential for profit.
We're talking about trends today, but you also have something interesting that you allowed me to republish in my book, where you talk about the opposite of trend. You talk about sideways markets. And, right now we're at a stage 2021 where it sure seems like everybody and anybody thinks they can do really well, especially when a lot of markets are going straight up. But markets don't always go straight up. So why don't you give a little bit of insight about that sideways period? Because you gotta keep enough money to stay in the game. If you lose all your money, you can't play when the trends come back.
Right. It turns out, and I took the stock market as the S&P 500, and I took a very simplistic moving average, and I said, okay, if we can get a trigger, a trend following trigger that's to the upside, and it actually moves at least 5% to cover costs and so on, I'll constitute that as a successful uptrend. And I'll rate that time spent in that period as an uptrend. And I'll log that into the database. And then I'll take the same thing to the downside. I'll log that in, and I'll figure out how much time we spend in up, down, and all the rest of the time are those signals that didn't even go 5%. So that's noise, that's whipsaws, that's the market's not going anywhere. It turned out the market goes sideways somewhere around 2/3 of the time it is spent over the last 40, 50 years. And if that doesn't, kind of hit your brain and get your mental side thinking, we've had a nice run in the stock market in the US, I know, with new highs all the time. And gosh, that's been going on 4 or 5 years. And it makes a lot of people look really brilliant, and there's been a lot of money made, but it can go away just as quick and maybe faster. It turns out that on the upside, there's somewhere between 25 to 30% of the period of time you spend in up markets, and then about 6 to 9% or so to finish off the 1/3 that markets actually trend to the downside. So the downside happens a lot quicker than the upside does.
Another question here, which kind of builds on everything we're talking about today, but still shows some of the confusion. And a gentleman says, "Hi, Tom. Looking at the rest of 2021, what do you forecast? What are you looking into for your next investment or trade?" And the reality is, and I'll let you explain this, you don't know.
I don't know. And I also don't try to predict. If I had my suspicions, I'm a little, well, let's put it this way. I trade a lot of different ETFs, the sector funds, and about half of those are sitting in cash now. They've been stopped out. I trade some momentum strategies. I had at the peak about a week or two ago, I want to say about 22 positions in some ETFs that were high momentum ETFs. As of a couple days ago, I'm down to 11. So there's been a lot of deterioration already. We're getting to see some sideways. It certainly isn't making new highs every day. And I'm starting to see some signs of in some of my stock index trading, where half the positions are to the upside and half of them are to the downside. So I'm seeing signs of sort of a sideways action. Now, whether that just kind of placates the markets and digests the gains that we've been able to enjoy over the last 5 years, and then off it goes again to the upside, which could easily happen, fine, I'll go long. If it means that it starts caving in, then the rest of those ETFs get sold off on stops. And I'm fully short the stock index futures, and we make money to the downside then. That's what we try for.
Tom, on the psychology side of things, the market psych side, the mindset side, is there anything that you've taken from your love of golf that has been useful in your market psychology, your market mindset?
Yes. The single easiest example is you will never be a perfect trader and you'll never be a perfect golfer. You only are trying to get better at your craft. I'm still learning. I just added that Bitcoin strategy thing 5 days ago. I'm still reading, talking to people. I get interviewed. I was interviewed this morning and tonight, 2 times in one day. So I get a lot of ideas. Sometimes when people ask me questions, maybe I get an idea from a question. I'm still trying to get better at the craft. And I think that's where golfers are too. And I think you try to get down to a little bit, what type of golfer do you want to be? Do you want to be the guy that keeps it in play, hits the green, makes the putt, get a par, move on? Or do you want to be the guy who swings for the biggest hit he could get? And sometimes it ends up in the woods, and sometimes you get the eagle, and your game is all over the place, but that's the kind of golf you want to play. I'm more the trying for the steady. I don't try to play golf, and try to aim for pins. I try to aim for middle of greens. I'm a good putter, so I can shoot a good score, or a decent score, not a great score, but a decent score for me. I kind of do the same thing in investing. I think I sort of just plod along and crank a lot of data. And I think the other day I did a post, and I think I had 58 different individual positions on across 8 strategies, and it takes half an hour a day.
I got to tell you, we've done so many podcasts without video. Now that we have video, I feel like I can just rapid fire the questions at you. It's like I've got a baseball and I'm just throwing them at you,
I got a couple of hands. I could probably catch those.
You're
fastballs.
Good. You're good at catching them. Really serious. It's awesome. Let's talk about a name that you mentioned earlier. I think maybe if you can share a story or an experience or just a lesson learned. I mentioned him first, then you mentioned him, and that'd be Ed Seykota, who I find is a really interesting guy. I've had a chance to meet and know Ed over the years.
Sure.
Just a fascinating man. What can you share about a lesson learned from Ed Seykota?
Well, one of the things that I thought was fascinating about him is he purportedly is one of the first people to computerize his trading strategy. And since I was such a fan of computerizing mine, it was kind of like he was the father of the computerization of trading strategies, I thought. So that was one thing. The other thing was that psychology is far more important and messes up traders more than your buy-sell engine, which you need to trigger what you're doing. I don't care whether you're discretionary or a systems trader. You got to have some kind of a trigger to motivate you to do something. And then the position sizing thing. I wrote that book on successful traders size their positions, why and how. And it's high school math. It's add, subtract, multiply, divide, but it's simply trying to size your position so that based on the risk of that trade, you're not going to over position that trade, and then it becomes dominant in your portfolio, and you no longer have a portfolio, you have one investment and a whole bunch of other little things that don't make any difference. He did a lot of that, and I appreciated the mental side. That's the third area of trading that has to come in. So you got your buy sell engine, you got your position sizing, and you got your mental side. And he was very oriented towards understanding yourself. And some of the books he recommended were interesting, philosophical types of books. And I think that don't underestimate as a trader the mental side. You can, if you don't have your mental side screwed on straight, I don't care if you have the whole thing computerized, you'll find a way to screw it up.
I'm not going to take you down the mental side again just yet, but you've mentioned position sizing. You mentioned position sizing. I'm seeing a lot of questions about position sizing. And one in particular, John's asking about what's your max percentage of capital that you would expose, is the way he's phrasing it. Yeah, at Trendstat, we used to run about 0.8, 0.7 on some illiquid markets. We'd get it down in the 0.5s of equity. And I use mark-to-market equity. Some people like core equity, which means the realized equity only, and they disregard unrealized profits. I don't like that because as a money manager, you're always tagged, your drawdown's tagged from the equity high to the day, and that's a mark-to-market equity high. So I figure I might as well use that to do my risk sizing. Today's in my portfolio, I can go as high as 1%. I wouldn't go above that myself. If you want to go above there, you're just going to get a more wild ride. And if you don't have enough capital to be able to even put a position on, you're going to have to exceed 1%. But I'm retired and I just plodding along, and I'm happy to make some profits to live off of. It's not, I don't need to, double my account this year like some people try to do. So for me, 1% is a good number. I tend to run more like 0.7, 0.8 right in there. Explain the quick math to people that might be thinking, well, I want to risk 4% on a trade or 5% or 10%. Game can be over pretty quick if you do that, huh? Yeah. The first thing I find interesting is most people immediately say, I'm going to risk 1%. So they go and they try to buy it at point A, and then they put their stop 1% below that. That's not what I'm suggesting you do. I'm saying you take your strategy and analyze the price movements, figure out your noise, figure out your buy point, where your stop loss point is. The market is going to set those points for you. Now that you know you got this much risk, turn it into a currency, like a dollar, and then say, I have this many dollars of equity, and what is that percent? This divided by equity gives me a percent. How many contracts does it take me of these to get up to 1%? And that's the number of contracts I would do. Somebody was asking about patience, and I think it's got to be tough when you first wrap your arms around trend following to realize that, yes, you've got your process, but you don't control the outcome. So it's a lot of sitting around and waiting for the rest of the world to do something with these markets and make them move, because you can't wake up each day and go to the ATM machine or the slot machine and make the money come out. I think a lot of people think the harder they work, the more money they can make come out. That's not the way it works. Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, there is sometimes commissions and other things, bid-ask spreads that you lose. Yeah, one of the things that you feel like sort of is that like you're watching the movie of the markets and you're just sitting there eating popcorn and things are happening and you have no control over it. One of my very favorite sayings that I say over and over again, I've said it so many times that my lovely wife Brenda now quotes me over and over again. The markets will do what the markets will do. That's so true. I mean, I have no idea what they're going to do next. But they go up, they go down, they go sideways, they do what they want to do. And your job as a trader is to sort of go along for the ride and watch it all happen. You do not have the power, unless you're worth, hundreds of billions, to move the market very much. Your job is to go along for the ride. That's why I called it Enjoy the Ride. Tom, let's go big picture for a second, because you've got some strong views, even though you don't, you're not taking your economics into your trading engine, your buy and sell.
Exactly.
But I'm sure that your perspective about economies that can get extended and markets that can get to extreme highs, these do cause you to have some sense of like, whew, I'm glad I've got something that can handle that. And since you've got so many decades of looking at so many different time periods, can you, again, this is not a prediction or anything like that, but can you give a sense to the audience about the ups and downs they're going to see? And perhaps even if you want to share your perspective about where you feel we are as an investing global population right now, feel free.
My concern is there's a lot of investors right now and traders that are enjoying the upride. I mean, for sure. And market hits new highs. They look like geniuses. Some people, I mean, if you did some of those meme stocks that you mentioned earlier, you could be up, literally thousands of percent over the last X amount of months or years. They get used to that type of movement, and you look at what they're doing, and I know I'm going to get a whole bunch of phone calls and emails and messages on Twitter and everything else. As soon as the market does cave in the next time, and it did it in 2000, it did it in 2008, did it during the COVID crash. I mean, you're talking 50% downs, you're talking 35% downs. That's going to hit people hard, and it's going to happen again. I mean, I lived through the crash of '87, which was 23% or something in one day for the Dow Jones. There's been a whole bunch of other incidences. The Iraq War, lived through two of those, the invasions. And when you get violent moves and to the downside, and you are completely unprepared for it, as most people are today, they're trading just to the upside, not to the downside. They have no strategy whatsoever to hedge themselves or to liquidate their position and go to cash or whatever. They're just continuing to find the latest momentum play that they can jump on for the next $5 and take another profit and hopefully compound it. I would be concerned, and I would really point to looking at, do you have the potential to do other strategies that might diversify you a little bit from an upside strategy so that you have some protection to the downside? My feeling about economies is we've got the United States spending money like a drunken sailor. And as Ronald Reagan probably would put it, that's an insult to drunken sailors. There's so much debt. There's so many things they're trying to do that, to me, are going to choke down the economy. They're not going to help it. A lot of small businesses have failed because of the COVID lockdowns. You still got Vietnam. We were just talking earlier, totally locked down. Michael's in jail, apparently, home jail. He has to stay. He gets to go out for food. But other than that,
it's not good for the economy, huh?
No, it's not good for the economy. So when you try to play that out, you start thinking, well, if this thing does sort of fall apart, then how does that pan out, and what does it do to stocks? And if things are really in a very bubbly type of a framework, and you touch it off for any incident, it could touch it off. It could be another breakout of the pandemic. It could be it could be just some kind of a default. A major company has a problem and has to declare bankruptcy, and it touches off some selling, and then one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you're down 20%. I think I'd encourage traders to think through that scenario and develop for themselves some protection mechanisms.
I'll add too that when you mentioned some of those historical drops, the fall of 2002, the NASDAQ reached a bottom of minus 77%.
Correct.
Now, to also add, someone's asking a question: how can you protect against 30 or 40% drawdowns? Here comes a second Mike book promotion. This is in Mandarin. This is the Mandarin version, Mr. Singapore over there. So that's my 5th edition of Trend Following. And the reason I bring it up, not because I only want you to go buy books. I mean, I'm not really making that much money from that, but There in that book, what I do is I explore the various times where we've had big events where markets have cratered. And I've contrasted what's happened during that time to trend following performance. So here we have, the regular stock market implodes. What's the trend following performance? So when someone's asking in the questions here and they're saying, hey, what can we do to try and mitigate a minus 30 or 40% drawdown? Well, if you're just talking about regular equities, trend following historically is fantastic. And the evidence is there, and you'll find it on Tom's website too. So, and Tom, I'll let you run with that.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to get money from the upside of the market or the downside, really. I like to try to think in two directions. It keeps me more balanced and more ability to roll with it, whichever way it goes. If you want to deal with the downside, you've got things like stock index futures that are very easy to trade. If you just dabble and do one of those, you've exposed yourself to the downside of the market. You've got the exchanges backing you up. It's a fairly comfortable position. You can leverage it as much as you need to do the job that you require. You could also short things like the SPY ETFs. The SPY is the Standard & Poor's 500. That gives you an exposure to a broad-based index. If the market in the S&P goes down 50%, and you're short the SPY, you're going to end up making a lot of money. There's all sorts of other ETFs that you could be more specific to whatever your portfolio is. I had a gentleman did a correlation study, and he was in Pacific Rim stocks largely. So he found a Pacific Rim ETF that he uses for his hedging, and he shorts that against his Pacific Rim stocks. Another way to do that. You could design it any way that you need to do to solve your own specific financial puzzle. You're not trying to solve mine, you're trying to solve yours. And I think that you just have to try to at least first embrace the fact that as much as 6 to 10% of the time, it's going to go down. And are you prepared for it? And it could go down significantly. And with all these computers out there, it can go down fast. So are you prepared?
Somebody just asked about market manipulation. And I don't know if they were here for my very first point that I read about the 3 best performing assets of 2021, a failing video game retailer, a cinema chain close to bankruptcy, and a dog-themed cryptocurrency. I don't think you could describe any of those as anything less than market manipulation. Yeah, but even if they're market manipulated, what does that mean, Tom?
It still means prices move, still means you can get out of the noise band into a buy signal and enjoy that ride.
Yeah. I mean, it's, let me build on also this NASDAQ going down 77% in 2002. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the crypto community is the wild swings in Bitcoin and other crypto has convinced a lot of 20 and 30 somethings to hold on for dear life. Right. So they are taking some wild drawdowns. I'm not sure they've got a strategy other than buy the dip, but it's interesting because I think, Tom, we saw for many decades that perhaps the boomer population kept saying less risk, right? And then all of a sudden this 20 and 30 something generation is like, let's go, hodl.
As a money manager, if I had even traded Bitcoin, and I don't care how I would have traded it, I probably would have been fired by just about every institution that hired me, and I would have had zero business. Being the chairman of Standpoint Funds these days, I asked Eric Crittenden, who about, have you thought about putting cryptocurrencies into the portfolio or anything? And not that I'm suggesting you do it, I'm just wondering whether you're thinking about it at all. And he said, it just doesn't make the cut. I can't even get enough volume in the futures contracts to be able to put on a position, and I can't deal with the actual cryptocurrency itself because of the nature of the investment. So there's no place to stick it. That's kind of the way a lot of people look at it these days. The professional money managers look at it as, that's kind of interesting, but Yeah, and there's a lot of movement, but and I think you're right. A lot of the people that I know that are in it, their strategy is buy the dips. That's their only strategy. So they're down 50% right now from the peaks. That would be a 50% drawdown, and they just brush it off. Yeah, but it's going to go back up. Don't worry about it. And I that's not me. I can't trade that way. If I have lose 50% on something, that's ridiculous. I'm cutting it loose and moving on to my next best investment.
Buy the dip is not trend following.
No, it is not.
Let me also add, because you brought up a name, and look, I don't have any financial interest in Eric Crittenden, but I will say Eric Crittenden is a guest who has been on my podcast many times.
Yeah.
And if somebody listening right now to Tom and I speak, if they want to get a further education on trend following, go find every interview with Eric. And you can find the spelling easily, but go find every interview with Eric, because he will add to what Tom and I are saying, and he's going to give it a different spin and a different angle, which is what you want. You want to hear as many different voices, because I would implore everyone listening right now is maybe you say, well, gosh, mellow Tom, maybe he's just full of it. And psycho Mike, maybe he's full of it. But here's the thing, what you want to do is you want to verify what our words. Don't trust our words. Go find the research. Prove it to yourself what we're saying is accurate, because that's what we both did.
Right. And Eric had to solve a problem of managing, potential future billions in a mutual fund, a 1940 active investment act mutual fund. So he had a completely different problem that he had to solve with his strategies than I have with my personal, or Mike has with his. So that's why I keep saying you can't just, one size does not fit all. Having conversation, Eric, if you want to interview with Eric and me, go to Standpoint Funds and write one of their first videos that they have in the video library is an interview that Eric and I did together. And that was a blast. So there's lots of free content out there that you can go look at and learn from. I mean, Michael and I have done, how many hours are we up to? 4.5, 5?
It's fun though. It's fun. I mean, like I said,
we have a good time.
Throw stuff at you,
Hey, sometimes Tom, in random order, it seems.
It's absolutely in random order. That's the way. Because you're a smart guy, so I have to keep you on your toes, right?
Okay.
What would be what would you do differently if you were starting over today? Here we go back in time. We've already established you had this trend following understanding, and we're winding down here. But if we go back in time and you were to do things over, what would Tom have done differently at 28? I mean, you're telling us today all your best wisdom because you've lived it over the decades. But what was there anything you would have done differently?
Probably got rid of coffee earlier, maybe. And also probably realized that my mental side, which in my 20s was really coming into being, my self-awareness was increasing, my discipline was increasing. That became, and is to this day, so much more important than actually the buy-sell engine. In the seminars, I'll show 5 different buy-sell engines that are trend following that are based on the same time period. And I'll show a picture of like crude oil coming down and giving a buy signal. And then I'll show where all those different 5 indicators gave you your buy signal. And they're all within 2 days of each other. It's either today or tomorrow. But the signal is giving you this big move in crude oil. So who cares whether you were in today or tomorrow if you're picking up $20 a barrel on crude oil? And that's kind of I think I was more obsessed when I started out, just like a lot of people are, with the buy-sell engines. And later, probably as I got into my 30s, I was heavily involved in position sizing and got a lot of that into trend stats day to day. And then finally, really embraced the mental side and figured out a lot of that, and everything was set. And I would probably reverse that if there was a way to do that.
By the way, I should add something that I find interesting about Asia, since half of us I'm in Asia, and a lot of the audience is probably in Asia. And I don't know the demographics of who's listening, but I will pass along that there have been some exceptional female trend following traders, Leda Braga, Liz Cheval, others. So it's a really interesting strategy that if you dive into it, there is no reason that you need to have a limitation based on your geography, your age, your sex. It's just not relevant. What's relevant is, are you going to go find guys like Tom and Itzakota and find and dig through their wisdom, Eric, and dig through their wisdom? I mean, that's what you need to do. But there's really no limitations here. It's an open game. Here's an odd sales pitch for the book. You'll never throw it away because it's so damn cool looking. I promise you.
And it's big enough it could be a doorstop.
Well, hold on. Well, this book with you and I, this is kind of a normal size book. The trend following book, this is like I can. This is
serious.
Yeah, I can.
Michael's trend following book is very heavy.
So listen, Tom, it's fun talking to you again, and I hope the audience enjoyed me probing Tom's mind. That's kind of what the book is all about. Again, me probing Tom's mind. So this is another extension of it. I guess if we could take this interview and transcribe it, it will be the next chapter in the newest edition, whenever that will come.
There you go. Well, it's been fun, Michael. Yeah, I always have fun with you with interviews. I never know what's coming next. That's always a fun way to be interviewed.
I don't know either, Tom.
Well, that's the beauty. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? But guys, Tom and Michael, thank you so much for truly and a really engaging session and a really insightful session. I really want to thank you guys, and especially Tom for staying up so late. For joining us here, and for all of our audience members. I see everyone in the chat just going on about how much they've enjoyed the session, and I truly have as well. So thank you so much, gentlemen. We really appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.